There are 17 rules for handling the illuminated manuscripts in Subarchive 7, and I have broken every one of them. My name is Sister Catherine Benedetti, and I have served as an archivist in the Vatican Secret Archives for 11 years. I was trained in paleography at the Gregorian University and have handled documents dating back to the 4th century. I follow protocols. I respect the sacred nature of our work. What I am about to tell you happened during the autumn of 2023, and I pray that by speaking these words, I might find some measure of peace. In September of that year, Cardinal Torretti assigned me to catalog a collection of 13th century illuminated prayer books acquired from the dissolved monastery of San Benedetto in Tuscany. The books had been sealed in their original copper-bound chest for nearly 2 centuries, and our department was finally authorized to examine them. My task was straightforward: document each manuscript's contents, photograph the illuminations for digital preservation, and prepare conservation recommendations. The workspace they assigned me was in Subarchive 7, 3 levels beneath the main reading rooms. The chamber was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with white walls, LED lighting that mimicked natural daylight, and a single mahogany desk where I could examine the manuscripts. A climate-controlled cabinet, secured with both digital and traditional locks, held the documents overnight. The air smelled of old stone and preservation chemicals, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat during the long hours of transcription. The first manuscript I examined was a book of hours dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Its pages were vellum, still supple after 8 centuries, and the Latin text was written in elegant Gothic script. The illuminations were extraordinary, Mary depicted in prayer, surrounded by intricate borders of roses and ivy, all painted with pigments that seemed to glow under my examination lamp. I spent 3 days photographing each page, noting every detail in my leather-bound logbook: the quality of the parchment, the composition of the inks, the style of the marginalia. On the 4th morning, when I unlocked the cabinet and opened the manuscript to continue my work, the text had changed. Where the previous day I had photographed the Pange Lingua, I now found a confession written in perfect medieval Latin. But this was not the confession that disturbed me most. Was the handwriting. Every letter, every careful stroke of the quill matched my own script exactly. The words described sins I had never committed: stealing wine from the sacristy during evening inventory, harboring impure thoughts about Father Martinez who served morning mass in our chapel, questioning the reality of the Eucharist during my private prayers. I sat motionless for several minutes, studying the page. The parchment was genuine 13th century volumi. Could tell by the texture, the way the ink had aged, the subtle variations in thickness. But the handwriting was undeniably mine. I compared it to my logbook entries from the previous day. The slant, the formation of each letter, even the particular way I crossed my T's identical. I photographed the changed page immediately, then checked my digital images from the day before. Yesterday's photographs showed the authentic Pange Lingua in its original Gothic script. Today's showed the confession in my handwriting. I sealed the manuscript back in the cabinet and climbed 3 levels to Cardinal Torretti's office. He listened as I explained what I had found, his weathered fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I showed him the photographs on my tablet, he studied them carefully. "Sister Catherine," he said finally, "I see only the original Latin hymn. Are you certain you're feeling well?" I looked at the screen. The digital image showed the Pange Lingua in Gothic script, no confession, no trace of my handwriting. But I was absolutely certain of what I had seen in the manuscript itself. "Perhaps you need rest," Cardinal Torretti suggested gently. "Return on Monday with fresh perspective." I spent the weekend in prayer and reflection, walking the gardens behind St. Peter's, wondering if the isolation of Subarchive 7 was affecting my mind. On Monday morning, I descended again to my work chamber and opened the manuscript. The confession was gone. The page showed the original Pange Lingua, exactly as it should be. I continued cataloging, photographing the remaining pages of the Book of Hours. Everything proceeded normally until I began work on the second manuscript, a Psalter, with illuminations of King David. On Tuesday morning, I found another confession written in my handwriting. This one was more detailed, more disturbing. It described moments when I had felt more attracted to the aesthetic beauty of Latin phrases than to their sacred meaning. It confessed to times when I had doubted whether my vocation was genuine calling or merely intellectual fascination with medieval culture. These were not thoughts I had entertained, yet they were written in my precise script on genuine medieval parchment. Again, when I photographed the page, the digital image showed only the original psalm. The confession existed only in the physical manuscript itself, invisible to cameras, impossible to document. By Thursday, the pattern had established itself. Each morning, I would find a new confession in my handwriting, replacing prayers or psalms in whichever manuscript I was examining. The sins described grew progressively more serious. Taking communion without proper spiritual preparation, feeling pride rather than humility when other archivists sought my expertise, harboring resentment toward the Mother Superior who had criticized my work the previous spring. But here was what truly disturbed me. Confessions were not random. They followed a progression, building towards something I could not yet see. The handwriting remained perfect, but the content grew more intimate, more personal, describing thoughts and feelings I had not yet experienced but somehow recognized as my own. On Friday morning, I found a confession that stopped my breath entirely. Written in my careful script, it described sins I had not yet committed but knew I would. Removing the manuscripts from Sub-Archive 7 without authorization, taking them to my private cell, attempting to study them by candlelight rather than the sterile LED illumination of the work chamber. I sat staring at the page, understanding finally what I was seeing. These were not confessions of my past sins, they were documentation of my future transgressions. The manuscripts were showing me the path I would inevitably follow, the rules I would break, the protocols I would violate in my growing obsession with understanding what was happening to me. That evening, instead of returning the manuscript to its cabinet as protocol demanded, I wrapped it carefully in preservation cloth and carried it to my cell. I lit 3 votive candles and opened it on my small wooden desk, searching for some clue, some explanation for what was happening. The pages I examined by candlelight showed confessions I had never seen before, written in my handwriting but describing thoughts I was having at that very moment. The decision to violate archive protocol. The rationalization that understanding this phenomenon was more important than following rules. The growing certainty that the manuscripts were somehow alive, aware, documenting not just my actions but my intentions. I spent the entire night reading these impossible confessions, watching my own future sins unfold across medieval parchment. When dawn broke, I understood that every rule I had broken, every protocol I had violated, had been recorded in advance, waiting for me to discover and fulfill each transgression. I returned the manuscript to Sub-Archive 7 that morning and submitted my final report to Cardinal Toretti. Conservation recommendations, digital catalog entries, standard archival documentation. I made no mention of the confessions, the changing text, the impossible prescience of medieval parchment. 3 days later, a new archivist was assigned to Sub-Archive 7. I was transferred to the main reading rooms, working with researchers and scholars on documented, well-catalogued materials. The 13th century manuscripts were sealed again in their copper-bound chest and moved to a restricted vault I do not have clearance to access. Sometimes, during my morning prayers, I wonder if my replacement has found confessions written in their own handwriting, documenting sins they have not yet committed. I wonder if this is how the manuscripts have always worked, patient and eternal, waiting for each new archivist to discover the path they will inevitably follow. I have told no one of this experience, but each morning, when I examine my logbook entries from the previous day, I check carefully to ensure my handwriting has not appeared anywhere it should not be. So far, my own script has remained confined to my own words, my own thoughts, my own time. But I know now that some sacred things are not meant to preserve the past, they are meant to document the future we cannot escape, written in our own hand, in our own voice, confessing sins we do not yet know we will commit. There are 347 manuscripts in Archive Sub-Level C, that we are forbidden to photograph. My name is Dr. Elena Toretti, and I have served as Senior Medieval Manuscript Specialist in the Vatican Secret Archives for 11 years. I tell you this because what I'm about to describe violates every protocol I've sworn to uphold, but some knowledge becomes too heavy to carry alone. The Church taught me that truth is sacred, even when it wounds. The Apostolic Archive houses over 85,000 manuscripts, some dating back to the 8th century. My domain occupies the third sublevel beneath the Cortile del Belvedere, where humidity controls hum constantly, and fluorescent lights never quite banish the shadows between the stacks. I arrive each morning at 7:30, descend 3 flights of marble stairs worn smooth by centuries of scholars, and unlock Archive Room C with a copper key that bears no number. The room measures exactly 30 feet by 20, with climate-controlled cases lining every wall. Manuscript Sublevel C houses our most delicate illuminated text psalters, books of hours, and illuminated breviaries created by anonymous scribes whose devotion transformed vellum into prayer. I've always found peace in their work. Each golden initial, each intricate border speaks of faith made visible, of monks who spent lifetimes copying sacred words by candlelight. The psalter that changed everything sits in Case 14, third shelf from the top, catalog number SC-1479/A. 15th century, probably Florentine, bound in worn leather with brass clasps that have oxidized to deep green. 153 pages of Latin psalms, each opening decorated with marginalia so detailed you need magnification to appreciate the artistry. Tiny birds perch on decorated letters. Vines curl around sacred text. Angels no larger than my fingernail play golden trumpets in the borders. I first noticed the change on a Tuesday morning in October 2023. My routine never varies. Arrive early, check environmental controls, examine any manuscript scheduled for researcher access. That morning, I was preparing SC-1479/A for Dr. Marchetti, a visiting scholar from Florence studying Tuscan scriptoria. As I opened the psalter to photograph the pages he'd requested, something in the marginalia caught my eye. The bottom border of Psalm 23 contained a phrase I'd never seen before. In elegant Latin script, barely visible among the decorative vines, Elena descendit ad caput meridi. Elena will descend to the chief at midday. My hands trembled slightly as I held the magnifying glass closer. The ink appeared medieval, showing the same oxidation patterns as the original text. But I knew this psalter. I'd examined every page dozens of times. This phrase had not existed yesterday. I photographed the page, recorded the anomaly in my daily log, and tried to dismiss what I'd seen. Manuscripts sometimes reveal details under different lighting conditions. Perhaps the phrase had always been there, hidden by centuries of accumulated handling oils or environmental factors. Such discoveries weren't unprecedented. But at 12:15 that afternoon, Cardinal Torriani's secretary called requesting I bring SC-1479/A to His Eminence's office immediately. Elena descended ad caput meridi. Elena descends to the chief at midday. The following morning, I arrived 30 minutes early and went straight to Case 14. My fingers shook as I opened the psalter to Psalm 23. The previous day's phrase had vanished. In its place, written in the same ethereal script among the border decorations, Elena inveniet litteras in scrinio quarto. Elena will find letters in the 4th drawer. I stood frozen for several minutes, staring at the impossible words. Then, moving like a sleepwalker, I crossed to the archival filing cabinets against the east wall. The 4th drawer contained correspondence files from the 1980s. Buried behind folders I hadn't accessed in months, I found 3 letters from researchers requesting access to SC-1479/A, all dated within the past week. All mysteriously misfiled in the wrong decade. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about medieval scriptoria, about monks copying sacred text by flickering candlelight. They believed they were channels for divine will. that God guided their hands as they formed each letter. What if something had been channeling through this particular scribe? What if the manuscript had always been writing itself, waiting centuries for someone to notice? The third morning brought new text. Elena interrogabit de antiquis regulus. Elena will inquire about ancient rules. I wanted to ignore it, to request transfer to a different archive section, but I couldn't. At 10:30, almost against my will, I found myself in the Historical Administrative Records room, pulling files about manuscript acquisition protocols from the 15th century. The Psalter had been acquired in 1497, part of a collection purchased from a disbanded Franciscan monastery near Florence. The monastery had been closed not due to typical ecclesiastical reorganization, but because of irregularities in devotional practices. The acquiring bishop's report, written in careful medieval Latin, mentioned texts that seemed to participate in their own creation, and scribes who claimed divine dictation of future events. Each morning brought new marginalia, new predictions that proved disturbingly accurate. Elena videbit umbrum in scala tertia. Elena will see a shadow on the third stair. I encountered a maintenance worker's shadow precisely where the manuscript indicated. Elena accipiet visitorem non expectatum. Elena will receive an unexpected visitor. Dr. Marchetti arrived without appointment, claiming he dreamed about a specific page in the Psalter. The predictions grew more personal, more intimate. The manuscript began documenting my thoughts before I had them, my decisions before I made them. Elena timebit veritatem. Elena will fear the truth. Elena quaeret auxilium sed non inveniet. Elena will seek help but will not find it. Elena sciet se observari. Elena will know she is being watched. I started arriving earlier, staying later, obsessively checking the Psalter multiple times each day. The marginalia appeared only overnight, materializing between my evening departure and morning arrival. I tried photographing every page before leaving, comparing them to morning images. The changes were always there in the morning photographs, as if they had existed all along. The manuscript began predicting my research activities, my conversations with colleagues, even my lunch choices in the Vatican cafeteria. It knew when I would need specific reference materials, when my computer would malfunction, when I would decide to work late. Most disturbing, it knew my growing desperation, my unsuccessful attempts to discuss the situation with supervisors who listened politely and suggested I might benefit from some time away from the archives. On November 13th, the marginalia read, Elena leget haec verba hodie ad vesperam. Elena will read these words today at evening. Below that, in script so small I needed maximum magnification to decipher it. Elena sciet manuscriptum scribere, non solum futurum sed etiam praesens. Elena will know the manuscript writes not only the future, but also the present. I understood then. The manuscript wasn't predicting my actions, it was prescribing them. Every decision I thought was mine had been written in those margins centuries ago. The Franciscan scribes hadn't been copying psalms. They had been copying lives, transcribing human experience before it occurred. The monastery had been closed because someone had recognized what I was only now beginning to comprehend. The manuscript was writing us all. That evening, as twilight settled over Vatican City, I opened the Psalter one final time. New text had appeared in the margin of Psalm 1. Elena dimittet opus cras, et nunquam revertet, manuscriptum novum scribam expectabit. Elena will leave her work tomorrow and never return. The manuscript will await a new scribe. I closed the book gently, returned it to case 14, and locked the copper key in my desk drawer. The next morning, I submitted my resignation to Cardinal Torriani's office. I told him I had decided to pursue opportunities in secular academic institutions. He accepted my decision graciously, mentioning that the archives had already identified my replacement, a young scholar named Dr. Marco Santini, who specialized in 15th century illuminated manuscripts. I never returned to Archive Sub-Level C, sometimes late at night. I wonder if Dr. Santini has noticed the marginalia yet. I wonder if he understands that his life is being written in margins smaller than pinheads, in script that appears overnight like divine revelation. The Church taught me that truth is sacred, even when it wounds. But some truths are too ancient, too patient to be spoken aloud. They write themselves in the margins of our days, in script we can barely see, by hands that finished their work centuries before we were born. Room 47 has been sealed for 38 years, and there is a reason we do not speak of what lies behind its copper door. My name is Paolo Benedetti, and I have spent 23 years restoring sacred art throughout Vatican City. I trained at the Istituto Centrale per il Restauro in Rome, studying under masters who taught me that every brushstroke on sacred walls carries the prayer of its creator. My hands have touched frescoes painted by disciples of Giotto, have carefully cleaned altarpieces that witnessed centuries of devotion. I tell you this so you understand. I know the difference between damage caused by time and damage that defies explanation. The call came on a gray February morning in 2024. Monsignor Toretti from the Vatican Properties Office requested my presence for a consultation regarding sensitive restoration work in a restricted chamber. Such requests weren't unusual. The Vatican contains countless hidden chapels, private oratories, and forgotten chambers that require careful attention away from public scrutiny. I arrived at the specified entrance beneath the Apostolic Palace at precisely 9 o'clock, carrying my standard assessment kit, high-resolution camera, pH testing strips, humidity sensors, and a magnifying loupe my grandfather had given me when I first began this work. Monsignor Toretti met me at a security checkpoint I'd never seen before, though I'd worked in Vatican buildings for over 2 decades. He was a thin man with careful eyes, who spoke in the measured tones of someone accustomed to handling delicate matters. Room 47 contains 14th century frescoes depicting the martyrdom of Saint Agatha, he explained as we descended a narrow marble staircase I hadn't known existed. The chamber was sealed in 1986, following structural concerns, but recent architectural surveys indicate the frescoes may be salvageable. The corridor beyond the staircase stretched longer than the building's external dimensions should have allowed. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the walls were listening. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of our passage. At the corridor's end stood a copper door, marked only with the number 47 in simple black numerals. Monsignor Toretti produced a key, unlike any I'd seen in Vatican buildings, longer than my palm, carved from what appeared to be bone rather than metal. "You will work alone," he said as the lock turned with a sound like breaking glass. "Document everything, restore what you can, report any irregularities." Directly to my office. He paused, his hand still on the door handle. "The chamber is not to be photographed for archival purposes. Your assessment photographs only, and those remain classified." The door opened onto a circular chamber approximately 15 feet in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above the reach of my flashlight. The frescoes covered every inch of the walls in a continuous narrative cycle depicting Saint Agatha's martyrdom. Even in the poor lighting, I could see the work was extraordinary. The figures possessed a dimensional quality that made them appear to breathe in the flickering illumination. But something was wrong with their faces. Every human figure in the frescoes bore the same expression of absolute terror. Not the serene acceptance typically shown in martyrdom scenes. Not even the righteous anger sometimes depicted in saints facing persecution. This was raw, primal, furies wide, with knowledge of something approaching. Mouths open in silent screams that seemed to echo in the chamber's stillness. The damage patterns were unlike anything in my experience. Rather than the typical cracking, fading, or water damage I expected in a sealed room, the faces appeared to have been deliberately scarred. But the scarring followed no pattern of vandalism or iconoclasm I recognized. I spent that first day documenting the existing condition, photographing each panel from multiple angles. The frescoes told Saint Agatha's story in the traditional sequence: her rejection of the Roman prefect Quintianus, her imprisonment, the torture of her breasts, her miraculous healing by St. Peter, and finally her death in prison. But in this version, every witness, every executioner, every angel bore that same expression of terror, as if they had all seen something beyond the edges of the painted narrative. The restoration work began the following Monday. I started with the eastern wall, where St. Agatha first appears before Quintianus. The saint's face had been damaged by what appeared to be deliberate scratching, deep gouges that obliterated her features. Working with conservation-grade pigments mixed to match the original palette, I carefully filled the damaged areas, building up layers of paint to restore the serene expression appropriate to a Christian martyr facing persecution. The work proceeded normally that first week. I followed established restoration protocols: cleaning, consolidation, filling, retouching. Each evening, I locked the chamber and reported my progress to Monsignor Toretti. Each morning, I returned to continue the painstaking process of bringing these sacred faces back to life. It was on the following Monday that I noticed the change. St. Agatha's face, which I had carefully restored to show peaceful resolve, now displayed the same terrified expression as all the other figures. The damage had returned exactly as it had been, but impossibly, the terror was even more pronounced. Her eyes seemed to track my movement across the chamber. Her mouth appeared to form words I couldn't hear. I photographed the face from every angle, comparing the images to my documentation from the previous week. The restoration had vanished completely, but this wasn't simple deterioration. The paint had been replaced, not removed. Where I had applied careful brushstrokes to create tranquil features, someone or something had painted over my work with expressions of absolute horror. This pattern repeated with every face I attempted to restore. I would spend days carefully reconstructing damaged features, following every principle of conservation I had learned. I would lock the chamber each evening, confident in my work. Each morning, I would return to find my restoration undone, replaced with increasingly vivid expressions of terror. The faces began to seem more alive, more present. Their eyes held depth that paint shouldn't possess. Their mouths appeared to move in my peripheral vision. By the third week, I began to suspect I was not working alone in the chamber. I would arrive to find my brushes arranged differently than I had left them. Paint mixtures I had covered carefully would be disturbed, as if someone had tested colors during the night. Most disturbing, I began to find additional damage that hadn't been there the day before. New scratches, new gouges, always concentrated on the faces, always creating that same expression of absolute terror. I started arriving earlier, staying later, hoping to catch whatever was undoing my work. The chamber felt different in the early morning hours before dawn. The shadows seemed deeper, more substantial. The temperature dropped noticeably, though no ventilation system served the room. And the faces began to seem less like paintings and more like windows into some other place, some other time where terror was the only appropriate response to what was approaching. On a Thursday in late March, I arrived at the chamber before sunrise to find the copper door standing open. I had locked it carefully the evening before, had heard the mechanism engage, had tested the handle, but now it hung open like a mouth, and from within came the sound of weeping. I entered slowly, my flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than usual. The frescoes appeared to shimmer, the figures moving slightly in the unstable light. The weeping continued, soft and constant, seeming to come from the walls themselves. As I approached the eastern wall where I had first attempted my restorations, I realized the sound was coming from St. Agatha's painted mouth. She was looking directly at me, not the optical illusion common in well-executed portraiture, but actual eye contact, actual recognition. Her terrified expression had intensified beyond anything human art could achieve. Her painted lips moved with the rhythm of the weeping, and in that impossible sound, I began to hear words. Non vedere, she whispered in Latin, soft as silk. Do not see. Non odir, do not hear. Non seer, do not know. One by one, the other figures began to speak. Saints, angels, martyrs, witnesses all repeating the same warning in voices like wind through broken glass. The chamber filled with their whispered pleas, overlapping, until the words became a constant susurration of terror and warning. They were not trying to frighten me, I realized. They were trying to protect me from something else, something that required their constant vigilance, their eternal watch. I understood then why the faces could never be restored to peace. They had seen something in this chamber, something that had burned itself into the sacred pigments. The terror in their expressions wasn't damage, it was documentation. The frescoes weren't depicting St. Agatha's martyrdom. They were depicting their own endless witnessing of something that should not be seen, something that required them to maintain their horrified vigil until the end of time. As dawnlight began to filter through cracks I hadn't noticed before, the voices faded. The faces returned to their painted stillness, but their eyes continued to track my movement. I gathered my tools with hands that trembled like leaves, locked the chamber, and climbed the impossible staircase to report to Monsignor Toretti. The frescoes cannot be restored, I told him. The damage is integral to their purpose. He nodded, as if he had expected this answer. Your services are no longer required, he said simply. The chamber will remain sealed. I never asked what the frescoes were watching. Some knowledge, as they tried to warn me, is too dangerous to possess. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, I find myself whispering their words. Non videre, non audire, non sire. And I am grateful for their eternal vigilance, for the terror they willingly bear so the rest of us might sleep peacefully, unaware of what waits behind the copper door of room 47. The catacombs beneath St. Catherine's Chapel have been sealed since 1724, and there is a reason the sealing was done in silence. My name is Father Antonio Marcelli, and I have served as night chaplain at St. Catherine's for 7 years. I tell you this because what I experienced challenges everything I believed about the boundary between prayer and torment, between devotion and damnation. The Church teaches us that death is not the end of service to God, but some forms of service, I have learned, should not continue beyond the grave. St. Catherine's Chapel occupies the northeast corner of Vatican City, a small sanctuary built in the 16th century above much older foundations. The chapel serves a specific function within Vatican operations. It remains open throughout the night for the private devotions of clergy whose duties prevent them from attending regular canonical hours. I arrived each evening at 10 o'clock, unlocked the heavy oak doors with a brass key blessed by 3 different popes, and maintained vigil until dawn. The chapel itself measures only 30 feet by 20, with rough stone walls that predate the Renaissance construction above. 12 wooden pews face a simple altar beneath a crucifix carved from olive wood brought from the Mount of Olives. Behind the altar, a wrought iron gate seals the entrance to what were once catacombs burial chambers that honeycombed the hill beneath Vatican City long before St. Peter's Basilica claimed the summit. The chambers had been sealed in the early 18th century, following what church records described only as irregularities in devotional practices among the interred faithful. My duties were straightforward: maintain the vigil candles, provide spiritual counsel to any clergy who came for private prayer, and ensure the chapel remained a sanctuary of peace throughout the night hours. Most evenings passed in quiet contemplation. I would say my breviary, tend the altar, and wait in the stillness that can only be found in sacred spaces after midnight. It was during these quiet hours that I first heard the chanting. The voices came to me gradually, so softly that for weeks I mistook them for wind moving through the chapel's ancient stonework. A whisper of Latin, phrases from the Psalms carried on air that seemed to move without source. The sounds appeared to originate from the sealed gate behind the altar, but I attributed this to acoustic properties of the old stone construction. Churches built on earlier foundations often carry sound in unexpected ways. The chanting followed the traditional patterns of Gregorian chant, the same psalms and antiphons I had sung since seminary. Deus in adjutorium meum intende, O God, come to my assistance. Domine adjuvandum me festina. O Lord, make haste to help me. The voices sang the night office with perfect precision, beginning vespers at the proper hour, continuing through compline, and maintaining vigil until lauds at dawn. Their devotion was absolute, their timing flawless. At first, I found comfort in these phantom voices. Night duty can be isolating, and the sense of joining in prayer with unseen companions provided spiritual solace. I began to sing along softly, my voice blending with what I imagined were acoustical echoes from evening prayers in other parts of Vatican City. The harmony was beautiful, otherworldly in its purity. But as weeks passed, I noticed inconsistencies that troubled my peace. The chanting continued even on nights when no evening prayers had been sung anywhere in Vatican City. The voices maintained their liturgical schedule regardless of feast days, holy days, or special observances that would normally alter the canonical hours. Most disturbing, they sang parts of the office that had been revised centuries ago, using Latin formulations that had not been heard in living memory. I began keeping detailed logs of when the chanting occurred, cross-referencing the voices with prayer schedules throughout Vatican City. The pattern that emerged defied explanation. The voices sang continuously, every night, beginning and ending at precisely the same times, following a liturgical calendar that corresponded to no current church practice. They were singing an office that had been abandoned before my grandfather was born. My first serious concern arose on the feast of St. Catherine of Alexandria, the chapel's patron saint. According to tradition, I should have heard additional prayers, special antiphons appropriate to the celebration. Instead, the voices sang the same nightly office they had maintained every evening since I had begun to notice them. They seemed unaware that centuries had passed, that the church had evolved, that their vigil was no longer required. I decided to investigate the source of the voices more systematically. Using a small recording device, I documented the chanting over several weeks. When I played back the recordings in daylight, the voices were clearly audible, emanating from behind the sealed gate with surprising clarity. The sound quality suggested the singers were not distant echoes, but present, immediate, as if they stood just beyond the iron barrier. The recordings revealed something else that chilled me to the bone. The voices never paused for breath. The chanting flowed without interruption, without the natural breaks that human singers require. Individual voices could be distinguished at a deep bass, several tenors, higher voices that might have been women or boys, but they sang as if breathing were unnecessary, as if they had transcended the physical limitations that constrain living singers. I brought my concerns to Monsignor Torretti, the administrator responsible for Vatican chapels. He listened to my recordings with an expression that grew increasingly grave as the phantom voices filled his office. When the recordings ended, he sat in silence for several minutes before speaking. "The catacombs were sealed in 1724, he said finally. A Benedictine community had been maintaining perpetual adoration in the burial chambers, singing the divine office continuously for over 2 centuries. When the practice was discontinued, the monks refused to cease their vigil. They claimed they had made vows that extended beyond death, that the prayers of the faithful interred there required their constant intercession." He paused, studying my face carefully. The abbot ordered them to end their vigil and return to normal monastic life. They refused. They sealed themselves in the catacombs, declaring their intention to continue the office until the end of time. The church hierarchy sealed the chambers from the outside when it became clear they would not emerge. "But that was 300 years ago," I said. Surely they died, yes." Monsignor Torretti's voice carried no comfort. The sealing was permanent. No food, no water, no way to sustain life. But Father Antonio, what if death was not the end of their vigil? What if their vows bound them to continue their service regardless of their earthly condition? That night, I returned to St. Catherine's with new understanding and terrible apprehension. The chanting began at the usual hour, But now I heard it differently. The voices carried a quality I had mistaken for devotion but now recognized as desperation. They sang not from joy or worship, but from obligation that had become torment. They could not stop, could not rest, could not find the peace that death should have provided. I approached the sealed gate with trembling hands. The iron was cold beyond the chill of stone, cold with the touch of centuries. Through the bars I could see only darkness, but the voices grew stronger as I drew near. They were singing the Te Deum, their words echoing from stone chambers that had not seen light for 300 years. Te Deum laudamus, they sang. We praise thee, O God. But in their voices, I heard no praise. I heard only the endless continuation of a duty that had become damnation, the perpetual offering of worship by those who could no longer choose to stop worshiping. I pressed my face to the cold iron and whispered into the darkness, Your vigil is ended. Your service is complete. Rest in peace. The chanting stopped. For the first time in weeks, St. Catherine's Chapel fell into complete silence. The sudden absence of voices I had grown accustomed to left the space feeling empty, hollow, as if something essential had been withdrawn. I waited, listening, hoping I had somehow provided the release these faithful souls had sought for centuries. But at 3:17 in the morning, the chanting resumed. The same voices, the same perfect liturgical precision, the same desperate devotion that could not end. My words had not released them. Nothing, I realized, could release them. They had bound themselves to an eternal vigil, and eternity, I learned that night, is a very long time to sing the same prayers. I completed my shift and reported to Monsignor Torretti at dawn. The voices continue, I told him simply. He nodded, unsurprised. They always have. Father Antonio, your services at St. Catherine's are no longer required. You will be reassigned to day duties at St. Peter's Basilica, effective immediately. I have never returned to St. Catherine's Chapel for night duty. My replacement, a young priest from Ireland, lasted only 3 weeks before requesting transfer. His replacement managed 6 days. The current night chaplain, Father Benedetto, has served for 2 months, but I have noticed the shadows beneath his eyes growing deeper each week. Sometimes, walking past St. Catherine's during daylight hours, I can still hear them faintly, the voices that cannot cease, the prayers that have become prison sentences, the faithful who discover that some vows extend far beyond the grave. They sing still, will always sing, offering worship that has transformed from devotion into torment, in catacombs that remain sealed, not to keep the world out, but to keep their eternal vigil contained within. The visitor logbook for Archive Section 7 must be signed by all who enter, without exception, even in death. My name is Sister Maria Joseph, and I have served as Senior Archivist for the Vatican's Restricted Religious Orders Collection for 14 years. I maintain this introduction because what I witness challenges every protocol I have sworn to uphold, but also because I believe some records must be kept, even when they document the impossible. The Church taught me that faithful service continues beyond death, but I never understood how literally this truth could manifest until I began working the night shifts in Archive Section 7. The Vatican archives contain over 53 miles of shelving, but Archive Section 7 occupies a special category within this vast collection. Located 4 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, Section 7 houses documents related to religious orders that have been dissolved, suppressed, or otherwise removed from active service. The materials here tell stories the Church prefers to remember quietly: failed monastic experiments, communities that developed unorthodox practices, and religious orders whose devotion exceeded acceptable boundaries. Section 7 operates under strict protocols established in 1947, following what administrative records describe only as irregularities in archival access patterns. All visitors must sign the leather-bound logbook that sits on the oak desk beside the steel security door. The book records name, institutional affiliation, research purpose, time of entry, and time of departure. No exceptions. No visitors after 8 o'clock in the evening. No access without proper ecclesiastical authorization. These rules have been absolute for over 70 years. I was assigned to night custodial duties in Section 7 in November of 2023. My responsibilities included climate monitoring, security rounds, and maintaining the integrity of documents that some considered too sensitive for daytime access. Most evenings passed in scholarly quiet. I would catalog new acquisitions, repair minor binding damage, and ensure the environmental controls maintained proper temperature and humidity for materials that, in some cases, dated to the early centuries of Christianity. The irregularities began subtly, as they often do in places where the sacred and the scholarly intersect. I first noticed additional entries in the visitor logbook on a Tuesday morning in late November. Between my final security check at 11:45 p.m. and my morning review at 7 o'clock, 3 new signatures had appeared in the book. The handwriting was careful, formal, in the style taught in convents during the early 20th century. The first signature read Sister Catherine Boniface, OSB, Research on Carmelite Reforms, Entry, 3:17 a.m., Departure, 5:32 a.m. The second, Mother Superior Agnes Toretti, O.P., Consultation of Dominican Disciplinary Records, Entry, M. Departure, 6:15 a.m. The third, Sister Mary Consolata, R.S.M., Review of Mercy Congregation Histories, Entry, 3:17 a.m., Departure, 7:00 a.m. I had been in the archive continuously throughout the night. No one had entered. The steel security door had remained locked, and I possessed the only key during night hours. Yet 3 visitors had somehow accessed the collection, conducted research, and departed, all leaving proper documentation in accordance with established protocols. My first assumption was administrative error. Perhaps day shift colleagues had forgotten to log earlier visits, and the entries were being added retroactively. But when I consulted our authorization database, none of the 3 names appeared in current Vatican records. Sister Catherine Boniface, Mother Superior Agnes Toretti, and Sister Mary Consolata were not registered researchers, had no pending access requests, and appeared in no contemporary directories of religious orders. The pattern repeated the following night. Different names, same entry time, exactly 3:17 a.m. The visitors described research projects that corresponded precisely to materials housed in Section 7, demonstrating knowledge of our collection that would require months of study to acquire. Yet I had never seen any of these individuals, had never processed their access requests, had never unlocked the security door for them. I began staying alert during the early morning hours, hoping to encounter these mysterious scholars. Section 7 felt different at 3 o'clock in the morning. The silence was deeper, more expectant. The climate control system seemed to whisper with unusual rhythm. The steel security door, which I checked obsessively, remained locked, but I began to notice that the temperature in the archive dropped noticeably around 3:15 each morning, as if the space were filling with cold air from some unknown source. On the 4th night, I heard footsteps. The sound was soft, measured, like someone walking with careful reverence through sacred space. The footsteps moved between the archival shelves with purpose, stopping occasionally as if examining specific documents. I could hear the whisper of paper being handled carefully, the faint creak of ancient bindings being opened, but when I investigated, following the sounds through the maze of shelving units, I found no one. The documents, however, showed signs of recent consultation. Books I had reshelved properly were now slightly askew. Files I had organized were disturbed, though not damaged. Most disturbing, the materials being examined corresponded exactly to the research topics listed in the logbook entries. Someone or something was conducting the studies they had signed in to perform. I decided to research the names appearing in our visitor log. The Vatican maintains extensive records of religious personnel, including obituaries and personnel files dating back centuries. What I discovered challenged my understanding of the boundary between life and death, between completed service and ongoing obligation. Sister Catherine Boniface had died in 1934, but her obituary noted that she had been conducting research on Carmelite reforms when illness prevented her from completing the work. Mother Superior Agnes Toretti had passed away in 1957 while investigating disciplinary practices in Dominican convents research that remained unfinished at her death. Sister Mary Consolata had died in 1941, leaving incomplete a comprehensive history of mercy congregations in Italy. Every name in our mysterious visitor log belonged to a deceased religious who had left scholarly work unfinished at the time of their passing. They were returning, somehow, to complete research they had been unable to finish in life. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt profound sadness. These faithful women had been so devoted to their scholarly service that death itself could not release them from their obligations. They continued their work in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the boundary between worlds grew thin, accessing archives that held the materials they needed to complete projects that had occupied their final years. I began preparing for their visits. I ensured that relevant materials were easily accessible, that reading stands were properly positioned, that adequate lighting was available throughout the archive. I never saw them directly, but I could sense their presence, dedicated scholars continuing their service with the same meticulous care they had shown in life. The pattern continued for weeks, different names each night, all linked to unfinished research projects, all signing in at precisely 3:17 in the morning. They worked quietly, respectfully, never disturbing materials outside their specific research interests. They followed all protocols, recorded their activities properly, and departed before the day staff arrived. On December 13th, I encountered one of them directly. I was cataloging new acquisitions near the medieval manuscript section when I became aware of someone standing at the reading table behind me. When I turned, I saw a nun in a habit style that hadn't been worn since the 1940s. She was elderly, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, bent over a volume of correspondence from a suppressed Benedictine community. She looked up as I approached, smiled gently, and nodded in greeting. "Sister Maria Joseph," she said in a voice like whispered prayer. "I am Sister Catherine Boniface. Thank you for maintaining these materials so carefully." Before I could respond, she closed the volume, returned it to its proper position on the shelf, and walked toward the security door. I followed, but when I reached the door, she was gone. The logbook, however, showed her departure time, 7:03 a.m., the exact moment I had seen her disappear. Over the following weeks, I learned to coexist peacefully with these scholarly spirits. They appeared each night at 3:17, conducted their research with professional precision, and departed when their work was complete. Some projects required multiple visits spanning weeks or months. Others were finished in a single session. All were documented meticulously in the visitor logbook. The most profound moment came on Christmas Eve, when I realized that the last of the recurring names had completed their research. Sister Mary Consolata signed out for the final time at 6:45 a.m. Her comprehensive history of mercy congregations finally finished after 83 years. The archive felt different after that nightlighter, more peaceful, as if long-held obligations had finally been fulfilled. I reported my observations to Cardinal Torriani in January. He listened without surprise, examining the visitor logbook with the careful attention of someone who had seen similar phenomena before. "Sister Maria Joseph," he said finally, "your services in Archive Section 7 are exemplary. However, we are restructuring night access protocols. You will be transferred to day duties in the main collections, effective immediately." My replacement lasted 2 weeks before requesting transfer to the Vatican Library. The current night archivist, Brother Augustine, has served for 3 months but rarely discusses his experiences. Sometimes, however, I see him in the morning with the expression of someone who has witnessed devotion that transcends death itself. The logbook continues to record visitors I never processed authorization requests for, researchers whose dedication proves stronger than the grave. They sign in at 3:17 each morning, conduct their studies with scholarly precision, and depart when their work is done. Some obligations, I have learned, extend far beyond life, and the Church's greatest scholars sometimes require centuries to complete their most important research. Archive Section 7 remains a place where the boundary between life and death grows thin each night, where faithful service continues in the hours before dawn, where the dead return to finish what they could not complete in life. The visitor logbook documents it all, every signature a testament to devotion that death cannot diminish. There are objects in Vatican City that continue their sacred purpose long after their owners have been forgotten, and we are instructed never to interfere with their devotions. My name is Cardinal Heinrich Voss, and I serve as Chief of Vatican Security Operations. I have held this position for 9 years, overseeing the protection of the Holy See's most sensitive locations, documents, and secrets. I tell you this because what I discovered in the abandoned novice quarters challenges not only security protocols, but our understanding of prayer itself and the terrible weight of souls who vanish from official records but never truly disappear. The Vatican contains numerous abandoned section swings sealed due to structural concerns, chambers closed following administrative reorganization, and quarters that simply fell out of use as religious communities evolved. The former novice quarters in the northeast section of the Apostolic Palace had been sealed since 1968, following the closure of a contemplative community whose practices, according to administrative records, had become incompatible with contemporary religious life. I conducted routine security inspections of sealed areas monthly, ensuring that abandoned sections remained secure and that no unauthorized access had occurred. These inspections were procedural, methodical, and typically uneventful. The novice quarters consisted of 12 small cells arranged around a central prayer room, with a simple chapel containing a wooden altar and stone font. The rooms had been cleared of all personal belongings when the community disbanded, leaving only the basic furnishings required for contemplative life. It was during my November inspection in 2023 that I first noticed the prayer beads. They lay on the altar in the small chapel, coiled in a perfect spiral around the base of a brass crucifix. The Rosary was beautiful 59 beads of polished obsidian, separated by small silver medallions depicting the mysteries of faith. The workmanship was exceptional, clearly handcrafted by someone with both artistic skill and deep devotion. What troubled me was that the Rosary had not been there during my previous inspection 4 weeks earlier. I photographed the beads from multiple angles, documenting their position and condition according to security protocols. The Rosary appeared to be antique, probably mid-20th century, showing the wear patterns of frequent use. The silver had developed the soft patina that comes from decades of handling during prayer. Most significantly, the beads were positioned as if someone had been praying recently. The arrangement suggested the Rosary had been set down mid-decade, between the third and fourth Hail Marys of a particular mystery. My first concern was unauthorized access. Someone had entered a sealed area and left behind a personal item, possibly as part of some unauthorized ritual or nostalgic pilgrimage. I ordered a complete security review of the novice quarters, checking every window, door, and potential entry point. All seals remained intact. No evidence of forced entry, no disturbed dust patterns, no footprints or other signs of human presence. Yet the Rosary had appeared from nowhere. I decided to leave the beads undisturbed and return the following week to see if they moved or if additional items appeared. Security protocol dictated that I should remove any unauthorized objects, but something about the Rosary's position suggested it was not abandoned, but actively in use. The beads seemed to belong on that altar, as if they had always been there. When I returned 7 days later, the rosary had moved. The beads now rested in a different configuration, advanced by exactly 10 positions on a complete decade of the rosary. They were arranged as if the invisible prayer had completed the sorrowful mysteries and begun the glorious mysteries. The positioning was too precise to be coincidental, too purposeful to be the result of vibration or settling. Someone or something was using these prayer beads to work through the traditional cycle of rosary devotions. I began visiting the chapel daily, documenting the rosary's position with photographs and detailed notes. The pattern became clear within 2 weeks. The beads advanced by exactly 1 decade every 24 hours, moving through the traditional sequence of mysteries with perfect consistency. Our Father's Hail Marys, Glory Best, the invisible devotions continued without interruption, following a schedule that suggested the prayer never paused, never rested, never broke their commitment to this perpetual rosary. The discovery that chilled me came when I began researching the history of the novice community that had once occupied these quarters. The Congregation of Perpetual Adoration had been established in 1934 by Mother Superior Catherine Toretti, who believed that contemplative prayer should continue without cessation, that the faithful should maintain constant communication with the divine through structured devotional practices. The community grew to 12 members by 1950, all committed to a life of prayer, silence, and spiritual discipline that exceeded typical monastic standards. The records regarding the community's dissolution were surprisingly sparse. Administrative documents mentioned theological irregularities and devotional practices incompatible with contemporary religious life, but provided no specifics. The community was disbanded in 1968. Its members reportedly transferred to other religious orders throughout Europe. No further documentation existed regarding their ultimate disposition. But when I cross-referenced the community's personnel records with Vatican databases, I discovered something disturbing. None of the 12 nuns could be traced beyond 1968. No transfer records, no death certificates, no subsequent assignments to other religious communities. They had simply vanished from all official documentation as if they had never existed. I began to suspect that the rosary's decades corresponded to these missing women. 12 nuns, 5 decades of the rosary, plus the introductory prayers. The mathematics aligned too precisely to be coincidental. Each bead might represent one of the disappeared sisters. Each decade a prayer offered for a soul that official records had chosen to forget. The truth revealed itself on December 7th, the feast of St. Ambrose, when I arrived at the chapel earlier than usual and witnessed the rosary in motion. The beads moved without human touch, sliding along their cord with the rhythm of practiced prayer. Each bead passed through invisible fingers with the smooth precision of devotion repeated countless thousands of times. I could hear nothing, see no one, but the rosary progressed through its sequence as if held by someone whose dedication transcended physical existence. As I watched, transfixed, I began to perceive outlines in the empty air, suggestions of figures kneeling before the altar, shapes that appeared more clearly in my peripheral vision than when I looked directly. 12 women in habits that had not been worn since the 1960s, their heads bowed in prayer that had not ceased for over 50 years. The realization struck me like a physical blow. The Congregation of Perpetual Adoration had not been disbanded. They had been erased. Their devotional practices had become so intense, so removed from normal religious life, that the Church had decided they represented a theological embarrassment. They had been systematically removed from all records, their existence denied, their history rewritten as if they had never served God within these walls. But their prayer had continued. Stripped of official recognition, denied even the acknowledgement of their service, they had maintained their contemplative vigil for decades. The rosary was their anchor to the physical world, the only proof that their devotion persisted beyond bureaucratic erasure. I knelt before the altar, joining my prayers to theirs. As I did, the temperature in the chapel dropped noticeably, and I felt the presence of the 12 sisters more strongly. They were not angry, not resentful of their treatment. They were simply faithful, maintaining their commitment to perpetual adoration regardless of whether the Church remembered or acknowledged their service. The Rosary completed its current decade and paused, as if the invisible prayers were considering whether to continue in the presence of an observer. Then gently, the beads resumed their movement, and I understood that I had been granted permission to witness devotion that transcended institutional memory. I remained kneeling until the Rosary completed its full cycle, 59 beads moving through invisible fingers with the practiced rhythm of prayer that had never ceased. When the devotions concluded, the chapel fell silent, but the silence was not empty. It was full of the peace that comes from fulfilled obligation, from prayer offered without expectation of recognition or reward. I filed no official report of my discovery. Some truths are too sacred for administrative documentation, too profound for bureaucratic processes. The novice quarters remain sealed, but they are not abandoned. They house a contemplative community that official records refuse to acknowledge, a congregation whose devotion proved stronger than institutional erasure. I continue my monthly security inspections, but now I bring my own rosary. I kneel beside the altar where 12 forgotten women maintain their vigil, adding my prayers to theirs. The obsidian beads continue their eternal cycle, each decade a testament to faith that neither time nor deliberate forgetting can diminish. Sometimes, in the silence between decades, I hear whispered Latin, not pleas for recognition or restoration, but simple prayers of gratitude for the opportunity to serve, regardless of whether that service is remembered. The Congregation of Perpetual Adoration continues their work, praying for a world that has forgotten them, maintaining devotions that will never end because ending was never part of their vocation. The Rosary moves through its mysteries each day, each bead worn smooth by invisible fingers, each prayer offered by hearts that chose eternal service over temporal recognition. They are the forgotten faithful, and their devotion continues in sealed chambers where official memory ends but true prayer never ceases. There are 17 mirrors in the abandoned convent quarters, and we are forbidden to look directly into any of them after sunset. My name is Giuseppe Alberti, and I have worked maintenance for Vatican properties for 28 years. I have repaired heating systems in chambers that predate the Renaissance, replaced windows in towers where cardinals once plotted the fate of kingdoms, and cleaned blood from stones in crypts whose secrets died with the Borgias. I tell you this so you understand that I am not easily disturbed by the strange atmospheres that cling to ancient religious buildings. But what I encountered in the Mother Superior's chambers violated every natural law I thought I understood about reflection, death, and the terrible persistence of unfulfilled obligations. The Convent of the Sacred Heart had been sealed since 1976, following what Vatican records described as irregularities in devotional practice and administrative concerns. The building occupied a corner of Vatican City that most tourists never see, a medieval structure whose thick walls had housed contemplative communities for over 4 centuries. My work order came directly from Cardinal Torriani's office. Prepare the Mother Superior's private chambers for conversion to archival storage, with special attention to preserving historical fixtures that might have ecclesiastical value. The chambers occupied the building's highest floor, accessible only through a narrow stone staircase that climbed past empty cells and abandoned chapels. The Mother Superior's quarters consisted of 5 rooms arranged around a central hallway, a private chapel, a receiving room, a study, sleeping quarters, and a small sacristy where she would have prepared for private masses. Each room contained built-in furnishings that reflected the austere beauty typical of contemplative communities: hand-carved wooden fixtures, stone floors worn smooth by centuries of prayer, and tall windows that faced east toward the rising sun. The mirror dominated the sleeping quarters, mounted on the wall between two arched windows that overlooked Vatican gardens. It was a magnificent piece, nearly 6 feet tall and framed in carved walnut, that showed the distinctive craftsmanship of 17th-century Italian artisans. The silvering had developed the deep patina that comes with age, but the reflection remained remarkably clear. According to my instructions, the mirror was to be cleaned and preserved as part of the room's historical character. I began my work in the late afternoon, following standard protocols for abandoned religious spaces. Each room required systematic cleaning, documentation of any damage, and removal of debris that might have accumulated during 3 decades of neglect. The chambers felt different from other abandoned areas I had worked in, not empty, exactly, but expectant, as if they were waiting for someone to return and resume activities that had been interrupted rather than concluded. The sleeping quarters unsettled me from the moment I entered. The room retained the essential furnishings that had served the Mother Superior during her tenure: a simple wooden bed frame, a kneeling bench positioned before a crucifix. But everything was positioned as if someone had just stepped out temporarily. The bed was made with military precision. Papers on the desk were arranged in neat stacks. Most disturbing, a rosary lay coiled on the windowsill, as if someone had just finished their evening prayers and would return shortly to begin the night office. I approached the mirror carefully, carrying my cleaning supplies and following the protocols I had learned for working with antique glass. Vatican maintenance guidelines require specific procedures. When cleaning mirrors in abandoned religious quarters, only approved solutions. Work in systematic patterns from top to bottom, and avoid making direct eye contact with your own reflection during the process. These protocols exist because mirrors in sacred spaces sometimes retain impressions from their years of service, and these residual images can be spiritually disturbing to encounter unexpectedly. I sprayed cleaning solution across the mirror's surface and began working with a lint-free cloth, keeping my gaze focused on the specific area I was cleaning rather than allowing my eyes to wander across the full reflection. The mirror responded well to treatment, decades of accumulated dust and humidity damage clearing away to reveal the remarkable clarity of the original silvering. But as I worked, I became increasingly aware of movement in my peripheral vision, shadows shifting in the reflected room that didn't correspond to my own movements, or the late afternoon light filtering through the windows. The sensation of being observed grew stronger as minutes passed. Not the general awareness of presence that sometimes occurs in abandoned spaces, but the specific feeling of being studied by someone with particular interest in my work. I could sense attention focused on my cleaning technique, approval or concern about how I was treating this obviously precious piece. The feeling was so strong that I found myself working more carefully, taking extra time to ensure that every streak was eliminated, every corner properly cleaned. When I completed the initial cleaning pass, I stepped back to inspect my work, still avoiding direct eye contact with the mirror's surface. But as I moved to gather my supplies, I caught a glimpse of the reflection in the window glass opposite the mirror. What I saw there made my blood turn cold. The mirror showed the sleeping quarters exactly as they appeared in reality, but with one crucial difference. A nun in an archaic habit stood beside the bed, her hands folded in prayer, watching me work. Her clothing indicated a contemplative order, the kind of severe floor-length habit that had not been worn since the early decades of the 20th century. She appeared to be elderly, with the serene features and perfect posture that come from a lifetime of disciplined spiritual practice. I turned slowly to face the mirror directly, violating every protocol I had been taught about working with reflective surfaces in abandoned religious spaces. The nun remained motionless in the reflection, but her eyes followed my movement with the alertness of someone very much alive. Her expression conveyed neither hostility nor welcome, simply the focused attention of someone observing a stranger working in what had once been her private domain. For several long minutes, we regarded each other through the impossible barrier of the mirror surface. She stood exactly where the bed was positioned in the real room, but in her reflected world, the space was arranged differently. I could see the suggestion of different furniture, a different arrangement of devotional objects, as if the mirror were showing me the room as it had existed during an earlier period of the convent's history. I raised my hand in a tentative greeting, hoping to establish some form of communication. The nun inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement, but did not mirror my gesture. Instead, she pointed toward the desk where I had noticed the carefully arranged papers. When I looked at the actual desk, the papers appeared to be blank old stationery left behind when the convent was abandoned. But when I glanced back at the mirror, the nun was nodding toward what appeared to be documents covered with text, as if she were trying to direct my attention to something important. I approached the desk and examined the papers more carefully. In normal light, they appeared blank, yellowed with age but bearing no writing. But when I held them at an angle that caught the reflection from the mirror, faint text became visible Latin phrases written in the careful script of someone accustomed to copying sacred texts. The words were difficult to make out, but I could discern references to perpetual obligations, unfinished devotions, and the sacred trust that binds beyond death. When I looked back at the mirror, the nun had moved. She now stood beside the kneeling bench, her hands positioned as if she were holding a rosary, though I could see no rosary in her reflected hands. Her lips moved in what appeared to be silent prayer, and I realized that she was showing me her daily routine, demonstrating the devotional practices that had structured her life in this room. Over the following hour, as I completed my documentation and prepared to leave, the nun continued her routine in the mirror's reflection. She moved between the bed, the desk, and the kneeling bench with the precision of someone following a schedule she had maintained for decades. Her movements were purposeful, reverent, suggesting someone whose day was entirely structured around prayer, study, and contemplation. The most disturbing realization came as shadows lengthened and the natural light in the room began to fade. The nun in the mirror became clearer, more substantial, as if she existed more fully in darkness than in daylight. Her routine continued, without pause, the same prayers, the same movements between furniture that existed only in her reflected world. I understood then that she was not a memory or impression left behind in the mirror's silvering. She was continuing her life exactly as she had lived it, unaware that the convent had been abandoned, that her community had been dissolved, that the world had moved on without her. I gathered my equipment quickly, suddenly desperate to leave the chamber before full darkness fell. But as I reached the door, I heard something that stopped me cold, the sound of Latin prayers being whispered behind me. When I turned back, the room was empty, but the mirror showed the nun kneeling before her crucifix, her lips moving in the recitation of Vespers, her devotions continuing as they had for decades. I completed my documentation and submitted my report to Cardinal Torriani's office the following morning. I recommended that the mirror be preserved as requested, noting its exceptional historical value and remarkable condition. I made no mention of its unusual reflective properties. Some discoveries I have learned are too dangerous for administrative reports. The Mother Superior's chambers were converted to archival storage within 6 months. The mirror was retained and protected, mounted now in a room filled with filing cabinets and document boxes. I have had occasion to work in that room several times since, installing additional lighting, repairing climate control systems, performing routine maintenance. The mirror continues to reflect the storage room exactly as it should: metal shelving, cardboard boxes, the efficient atmosphere of bureaucratic organization. But I never work in that room after sunset, and sometimes, when late afternoon shadows begin to gather, I catch glimpses of movement in the mirror that doesn't match the current room. A figure kneeling in prayer where now there are only file cabinets. The Mother Superior, I believe, continues her devotions in a world that exists only in silver and reflection, maintaining the spiritual discipline that structured her life, unaware that her service is no longer required, that her vigil has become eternal not by choice, but by the terrible weight of unfulfilled obligation. The mirror reflects what it has always reflected. A room where prayers are offered, where devotion structures every hour, where a faithful servant of God continues her duties regardless of whether anyone remembers her name or acknowledges her service. Some reflections, I have learned, show us not what is, but what refuses to cease, even when the world that gave it meaning has moved on without witness or memory. When a bell begins to ring its sequence backwards, it is counting down to something that should never reach zero. My name is Father Marcus Benedetti, and I serve as night librarian for the convent archive of St. Scholastica, housed in the medieval tower that overlooks Vatican Gardens from the northeast corner of the Holy See. I have maintained this position for 12 years, custodian of records that document 8 centuries of contemplative life within these walls. I tell you this because what I witnessed during the autumn of 2024 challenges everything I believed about the relationship between time, memory, and the terrible weight of institutional forgetting. The Tower Library occupies 4 floors of a structure built in 1327, with the bell chamber at the summit and archive rooms descending through levels of increasing antiquity. My duties begin each evening at 6 o'clock, when I assume responsibility for maintaining the collection, processing research requests, and ensuring that the historical records remain accessible to scholars studying the development of contemplative communities within Vatican City. The tower's isolation makes it ideal for focused scholarly work, few distractions, excellent natural light during daytime hours, and the rhythmic structure provided by the Vespers bell that chimes each evening at precisely 6:30. The bell system was installed in the 15th century, replacing an earlier mechanism whose bronze had been requisitioned for papal artillery during the siege of 1427. The current bell measures 4 feet in diameter, cast in Florence, and inscribed with Latin verses praising the contemplative life. Its voice carries across Vatican Gardens with remarkable clarity, calling the faithful to evening prayers with a sequence of 12 chimes that has remained unchanged for over 500 years. The bell's rhythm structures my evening routine. When I hear its call, I pause my work for private prayer before continuing with archival duties that often extend past midnight. The irregularities began on October 15th, during my routine cataloging of newly acquired documents from a dissolved convent in Tuscany. I was working on the 2nd floor of the tower, updating acquisition records, when the Vespers bell began its evening sequence. But instead of the familiar pattern of 12 ascending chimes, the bell rang in reverse, starting with the highest note and descending through the traditional sequence backwards, ending with the deep bass tone that normally began the call to prayer. At first, I attributed the anomaly to mechanical problems. Medieval bell systems require constant maintenance, and the tower's mechanism was nearly 600 years old. I made a note to contact Vatican maintenance regarding the reverse sequence, but continued with my cataloging work. However, as I processed the Tuscan documents, I noticed something disturbing. One of the nuns listed in the community's personnel records had vanished from the text. Sister Catherine Benedetta, mentioned prominently in the Mother Superior's correspondence from 1894, no longer appeared in any of the documents I had cataloged just hours earlier. Her name had been systematically removed from every letter, every administrative record, every reference to community life during her documented service period. The documents showed no signs of alteration or erasure marks, no evidence of tampering. The text flowed naturally, as if Sister Catherine Benedetta had never existed. I spent the following evening carefully documenting the bell's sequence, using a digital recorder to capture the exact timing and tone of each chime. The Vespers bell continued to ring backwards, and each evening brought new disappearances from the historical records. Sister Maria Consolata vanished from 19th century correspondence. Mother Superior Agnes Toretti disappeared from administrative documents spanning 30 years of service. The pattern was always the same: complete, seamless removal, as if these women had never lived, never prayed, never dedicated their lives to contemplative service within these walls. The connection between the backwards bell and the disappearing records became undeniable after a week of careful observation. Each reversed chime corresponded to the erasure of one individual from the convent's historical documentation. The bell was not simply malfunctioning, it was systematically undoing the convent's past, removing the faithful who had served here, eliminating their contributions to 8 centuries of religious life. I began staying later each night, cross-referencing records, attempting to track the disappearances and understand their pattern. The bell seemed to be working through the convent's history chronologically, starting with the most recent members and moving backwards through time. Modern nuns disappeared first, then their 19th century predecessors, then earlier and earlier members of the community. The process was methodical, inexorable, suggesting that something was deliberately erasing the convent's institutional memory. The horror deepened when I realized that my own memory was being affected. I began to forget names of nuns I had studied for years, faces that had become familiar through repeated examination of historical photographs, stories that had formed the foundation of my scholarly understanding of contemplative life. The erasure was not limited to documents, it was affecting my capacity to remember the very people whose lives I had dedicated my career to preserving. By early November, the disappearances had reached the 18th century. Entire decades of convent life were vanishing from the records, leaving gaps in institutional history that I could feel but no longer clearly remember. The bell's backwards sequence had become a nightly countdown, each reversed chime marking another soul consigned to complete oblivion. I began to suspect that the bell itself was somehow responsible, that its reversed sequence was actively undoing the past rather than simply marking its disappearance. Medieval bells were often considered sacred objects, blessed and consecrated for specific purposes. What if this particular bell had been designed not just to call the faithful to prayer, but to maintain some form of spiritual equilibrium within the convent? What if its reversal was a response to some disturbance in that equilibrium, some violation of the sacred order it had been created to preserve? The answer came on November 13th, when I discovered the sealed chamber behind the archive's main collection area. I had been searching for earlier records, hoping to find documentation that predated the bell's installation, when I noticed irregularities in the tower's interior stonework. A section of wall on the lowest level showed signs of having been sealed and reopened multiple times over the centuries. Following protocols for potential archaeological discoveries, I contacted Cardinal Torriani's office and received permission to investigate the anomaly. Behind the stonework lay a small chamber containing documents that predated any records in the main collection, but these were not typical convent archives. They were condemnation records, documentation of trials, censures, and disciplinary actions taken against members of the contemplative community for theological crimes that the Church preferred to forget. Heretical teachings, unauthorized mystical practices, claims of direct divine revelation that challenged ecclesiastical authority. The records showed that dozens of nuns throughout the convent's history had been quietly removed from official documentation following theological investigations. Their names had been systematically erased from administrative records, their contributions to community life eliminated, their very existence denied. The sealed chamber contained the only remaining evidence of their service, hidden away to ensure that their erasure remained complete. As I read through these forbidden records, I began to understand the terrible truth about the backwards bell. It was not undoing the convent's history randomly, it was completing an erasure process that had been interrupted centuries ago. The nuns who were disappearing from the historical records were not being erased for the first time. They were being erased again, more thoroughly, as part of an institutional forgetting that demanded perfect completion. The bell was counting backwards through the convent's true history, ensuring that every trace of theological irregularity, every hint of unauthorized spiritual practice, Every record of nuns who had challenged accepted doctrine would be eliminated forever. The process had been interrupted at some point, allowing some records to survive in the main collection. Now it was resuming, working backwards through time to complete the systematic obliteration of institutional memory. On the night of November 20th, I made a decision that violated every protocol I had sworn to uphold as keeper of these records. Instead of documenting the erasure process, I began actively resisting it. I photocopied documents before they could disappear, created duplicate records using my own handwriting, and hid copies throughout the tower where the mysterious force behind the backwards bell might not think to look. My resistance proved futile. The copies disappeared as quickly as I created them, not just from the tower but from my memory as well. The bell's power extended beyond physical documents. It was erasing the very capacity to remember what had been eliminated. I began to forget my own research, my own discoveries, even my own efforts to preserve what was being systematically destroyed. The backwards bell continued its countdown through December, its reverse sequence marking the elimination of medieval nuns, early contemplatives, the foundresses who had established the community in the 13th century. Each evening brought the bell's call one step closer to zero, one step closer to the complete erasure of 8 centuries of contemplative life. On December 21st, the bell completed its final backward sequence. For the first time in my memory, Vespers passed in silence. The following evening, the bell resumed its normal pattern 12 ascending chimes, calling the faithful to evening prayer. But when I consulted the convent records, I found only empty shelves, blank ledgers, documents that contained no names, no dates, no evidence that any contemplative community had ever existed within the tower walls. I submitted my resignation to Cardinal Torriani's office on Christmas Eve, citing health concerns that prevented me from continuing my duties as night librarian. He accepted my decision graciously, mentioning that the tower archives were being converted to storage for Vatican administrative records, as the historical collection had proven to be of little scholarly value. I never returned to the tower library. Sometimes, walking through Vatican gardens in the evening, I hear the Vespers bell calling the faithful to prayer with its traditional sequence of ascending chimes. But I can no longer remember what I was trying to preserve in that tower, what records I had spent 12 years maintaining, or why the sound of a bell ringing backwards fills me with such profound and inexplicable dread. The institutional memory I dedicated my life to protecting has been erased so completely that even I cannot recall what was lost. The backwards bell accomplished its purpose with perfect efficiency, eliminating not just records but the very capacity to remember that there had ever been anything worth preserving. Some erasures, I have learned, are so thorough that they eliminate even the knowledge that anything has been erased, leaving only the haunting sense that something important has vanished forever, beyond the reach of memory or recovery. When the Vespers bell rings its sequence backwards, it is calling the faithful not to prayer but to judgment. My name is Father Marcus Benedetti, and I serve as night custodian of the archive of St. Scholastica, housed in the medieval tower that stands at the northeast corner of Vatican City. For 9 years, I have maintained the historical records of the contemplative community that once occupied this tower, documents spanning 6 centuries of cloistered life, prayer schedules, correspondence between Mother Superiors, and the careful accounting of souls who dedicated their lives to perpetual adoration. I tell you this because what I witnessed during the winter of 2024 has convinced me that some archives are not meant to preserve history, but to contain it. The tower rises 7 stories above Vatican Gardens, its medieval stonework housing one of the most complete collections of convent records in church history. The Archive of St. Scholastica contains over 12,000 documents relating to the Congregation of Perpetual Adoration, a contemplative community that maintained continuous prayer vigils from 1347 until their mysterious dissolution in 1968. My duties begin each evening at 7 o'clock when the day staff departs, and I assume responsibility for preserving materials that scholars rarely request, but that the Church considers too historically significant to relocate. The Vespers bell crowns the tower, a bronze instrument cast in 1563 and inscribed with Latin verses commemorating the contemplative life. Each evening at precisely 6:30, the bell chimes 12 times in ascending sequence, its voice carrying across Vatican City with the same rhythm that has called the faithful to prayer for over 4 centuries. The bell's mechanism operates through a system of weighted chains and counterbalances that have required minimal maintenance throughout their long service. Cardinal regulations require that I document any irregularities in the bell's operation, as its consistent timing serves as a chronometer for various Vatican ceremonies. The anomaly began on December 3rd, during my routine cataloging of correspondence from the 1800s. I was working on the 5th floor of the tower, cross-referencing letters between the convent and various church authorities, when the Vespers bell began its evening sequence. Instead of the familiar ascending chimes that had structured my work routine for 9 years, the bell rang backwards 12 chimes, descending from the highest pitch to the lowest, reversing a sequence that had remained unchanged since the Renaissance. My first assumption was mechanical failure. Medieval clock mechanisms occasionally develop irregularities, particularly during winter months when temperature fluctuations affect metal components. I noted the reverse sequence in my daily log and planned to contact Vatican maintenance in the morning. However, as I continued cataloging the 18th century correspondence, I noticed something that made my hands tremble. Sister Catherine Boniface, whose letters I had been transcribing for 3 days, had vanished from every document. Not erased, vanished. The letters flowed naturally around spaces where her name should have appeared, sentences restructuring themselves to maintain grammatical coherence while eliminating all trace of her existence. Mother Superior Agnes Toretti's correspondence now discussed administrative matters with an unnamed assistant whose contributions were acknowledged but whose identity had been completely removed from the historical record. I spent the following evening carefully monitoring the bell's sequence while simultaneously checking documents I had processed during previous weeks. The Vespers bell continued to ring backwards, and with each reversed chime, another name disappeared from the archives. Sister Maria Consolata vanished from personnel records spanning 40 years of service. Mother Superior Benedetta Toriani was eliminated from decades of administrative correspondence. The pattern was methodical, working through the convent's population chronologically from most recent to earliest records. By the end of the week, I understood that I was witnessing something unprecedented in my archival experience: the systematic erasure of institutional memory, performed not by human authority but by some force that operated through the tower's own infrastructure. The backwards bell was not malfunctioning, it was functioning according to a purpose I had never understood. I began staying later each night, documenting the disappearances and attempting to understand their pattern. The erased nuns were not being selected randomly. They were being removed in a specific sequence that corresponded to their order of disappearance from church records during the convent's final years. I consulted administrative files from the 1960s and discovered that the Congregation of Perpetual Adoration had not been dissolved due to declining vocations, as I had always assumed. They had been disbanded following what church documents described as theological irregularities requiring immediate intervention. The nature of these irregularities was never specified in official records. But as I researched deeper into Vatican administrative archives, I found references to unauthorized prayer practices, claims of direct divine revelation, and mystical experiences that challenged established doctrine. The convent had been closed not because it was failing, but because it had been succeeding in ways that made church authorities uncomfortable. The horror deepened when I realized that my own memory was being affected. I began to forget nuns whose names I had known for years, faces that had become familiar through repeated examination of community photographs, stories that had formed the foundation of my understanding of contemplative life. The backwards bell was not only erasing written records, it was eliminating the capacity to remember what had been erased. On December 15th, I discovered the sealed chamber. While searching for early records that might explain the bell's original purpose, I noticed irregularities in the tower's first-floor stonework. A section of wall showed signs of having been opened and resealed multiple times over the centuries. Following established protocols for potential archaeological discoveries, I obtained permission from Cardinal Torriani's office to investigate the anomaly. Behind the stonework lay a small chamber containing documents that predated the main archive collection. But these were not typical convent records. They were trial transcripts, condemnation proceedings, and disciplinary actions taken against members of the Congregation of Perpetual Adoration for practices that the Church had deemed heretical. The sealed chamber contained evidence that dozens of nuns throughout the convent's history had been quietly removed from official documentation following theological investigations that were never meant to become public knowledge. As I read through these forbidden records, the truth became clear. The Vespers bell had been installed not to call the faithful to prayer, but to maintain a form of spiritual surveillance over the contemplative community. Its backward sequence was a coded signal, activated when the bell detected theological deviation among the nuns it was meant to monitor. The reverse chimes were not a malfunction, they were an alarm, indicating that the bell had identified threats to orthodox doctrine that required elimination from institutional memory. The mechanism had been dormant for decades, but something had reactivated its monitoring function. Perhaps my own research had triggered sensors designed to detect unauthorized inquiry into the convent's hidden history. Perhaps the bell had been programmed to activate periodically, ensuring that any surviving evidence of theological irregularity would be systematically purged from church records. On the night of December 21st, I experienced the bell's true power directly. I was working in the archive's main collection when the Vespers bell began its backward sequence at precisely 3:17 in the morning, not its usual evening schedule, but the hour when the contemplative community had traditionally begun their most intensive prayer vigils. As the reversed chimes echoed through the tower, I felt my own memories beginning to dissolve. 9 years of archival work vanished from my consciousness. Names I had studied, documents I had cataloged, historical patterns I had discovered, all of it faded like ink in water. I could feel the bell's influence reaching into my mind, systematically removing any knowledge that might pose a threat to official church history. The backwards chimes were not just erasing records, they were erasing the archivist who had studied them. I fought against the mental dissolution, trying to hold on to fragments of what I was losing. But the bell's power was absolute. By the time the reverse sequence completed its 12 chimes, I could no longer remember why I had been concerned about missing names in historical documents, or what pattern I thought I had discovered in the convent's dissolution. When Cardinal Torriani's assistant contacted me the following morning, I was informed that my services as night custodian were no longer required. The archive of St. Scholastica was being consolidated with other Vatican collections, as the historical materials had proven to be of minimal scholarly value. The tower would be converted to administrative storage for diocesan correspondence. I accepted the reassignment graciously, though I could not explain the profound sense of loss that accompanied my departure from the tower. Sometimes, walking through Vatican gardens in the evening, I hear the Vespers bell calling the faithful to prayer with its traditional sequence of ascending chimes. But I can no longer remember what work I performed in that tower, what records I maintained, or why the sound of bells fills me with such inexplicable unease. The backwards bell accomplished its purpose with perfect efficiency. It eliminated not just inconvenient historical evidence, but the very capacity to remember that anything had been eliminated. I submitted this account to church authorities as a routine transfer report, documenting my final duties in the archive of St. Scholastica. They filed it with administrative records that no one will ever read, another document in an institution that has perfected the art of forgetting what it chooses not to remember. Some knowledge, I have learned, carries its own destruction. The Vespers bell continues its evening calls to prayer, but I suspect it remains ready to ring backwards again whenever someone ventures too close to truths that were buried for reasons too dangerous to recall. The confession records in Archive Section 12 are filed by date of absolution, not date of sin, and there is a reason we do not examine the discrepancy too closely. My name is Brother Timothy Marcelli, and I serve as Senior Archive Keeper for the Vatican's historical confession records, housed 3 levels beneath the Apostolic Palace, in chambers that predate the current basilica by several centuries. For 15 years, I have maintained the confidential documentation of sacramental confessions, deemed significant enough to preserve for theological study records of extraordinary penances, unusual spiritual phenomena, and cases that required consultation with church authorities before absolution could be granted. I tell you this because what I discovered in the winter of 2024 challenges everything I believed about the nature of sin, time, and the terrible weight of foreknowledge. The historical confession archives occupy a labyrinth of underground chambers originally constructed as burial crypts for early Christian martyrs. The Church repurposed these spaces in the 16th century to house documents that required both preservation and extreme confidentiality. The archive contains over 30,000 confession records dating from the 14th century to the present, all organized according to a classification system that accounts for theological complexity, canonical significance, and the level of discretion required to protect the identity of penitents whose confessions might prove scandalous, if revealed. My duties include cataloging new acquisitions, maintaining environmental controls that preserve documents spanning 7 centuries, and ensuring that access to sensitive materials remains restricted according to protocols established by successive popes. Archive Section 12 houses the most confidential records confessions involving clergy, members of religious orders, and lay people whose sins had implications for church politics or theological doctrine. These documents require special handling and can only be accessed with written authorization from the Cardinal Secretary of State. The anomalous records came to my attention during routine reorganization of 19th century materials. I was processing a collection of confession logs from 1823, documentation from a contemplative convent that had been dissolved following administrative irregularities that church records never fully explained. The logs contained standard entries, minor infractions of convent rules, struggles with spiritual discipline, the everyday sins that religious communities address through regular sacramental confession. But buried within these routine records, I found 17 confessions that defied every principle of temporal logic I understood. The confessions were recorded on consecutive days in March of 1823, all heard by the same priest father, Alessandro Torretti, who served as spiritual director for the contemplative community. Each confession followed an identical pattern. A nun would present herself for the sacrament and confess to sins she claimed to have committed tomorrow. Not sins she planned to commit, not temptations she feared she might succumb to, but specific transgressions she described as having already occurred in her future. Sister Catherine Benedetta confessed on March 15, 1823, to disturbing the sacred vessels during Vespers on the 16th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1823. Sister Maria Consolata confessed on March 16th to speaking falsely to the Mother Superior during morning prayers on the 17th day of March. The pattern continued through March 31st, each nun confessing to specific sins she claimed to have committed on the day following her confession. Father Torretti's notes, written in the careful Latin script typical of educated clergy, documented his growing distress with these temporal impossibilities. Sister Agnes presents herself for confession of sins not yet committed, he wrote. When questioned about the nature of her transgression, she describes events in precise detail, naming witnesses, specifying times, providing information that could only come from direct experience. Yet these events have not occurred. What made these records particularly disturbing was that Father Toretti had verified the accuracy of each prophecy. His notes confirmed that every sin confessed in advance had indeed occurred exactly as described. Sister Catherine Benedetta did disturb the sacred vessels during Vespers on March 16th. Sister Maria Consolata did speak falsely to the Mother Superior on March 17th. The confessions were not expressions of intent or fear, they were accurate reports of future transgressions delivered with the precision of historical documentation. I spent weeks cross-referencing these impossible confessions with other archive materials, hoping to find some explanation for the temporal anomaly they represented. The convent's administrative records from 1823 showed increasing concern about irregularities in devotional practice and theological confusion among the contemplative community. April of that year, church authorities had ordered a complete investigation of the convent's spiritual practices, leading to the community's dissolution and the dispersion of its members to other religious orders. The investigation records, sealed for 200 years and recently declassified for historical research, revealed that the convent had been experimenting with mystical practices that pushed the boundaries of orthodox spirituality. The nuns had been attempting to achieve states of divine union that transcended normal temporal limitations, seeking communion with God that would allow them to experience His eternal perspective on past, present, and future simultaneously. According to the investigation testimony, several nuns had reported visions of their own future actions during extended prayer vigils. These visions had been so vivid, so detailed, that the nuns felt compelled to confess them as if they were memories rather than prophecies. The practice had spread throughout the community, creating a situation where the entire convent was confessing to sins that had not yet been committed, but which they had experienced through mystical revelation. The horror of this discovery deepened when I realized that the dates mentioned in the 1823 confessions corresponded to recent incidents in Vatican City. Sister Catherine Benedetta's confession mentioned disturbing the sacred vessels during Vespers on the 16th day of March. On March 16th, 2024 exactly, 201 years later, a Vatican maintenance worker had accidentally damaged a chalice during evening cleaning of St. Peter's Basilica. Sister Maria Consolata's confession referenced speaking falsely to the Mother Superior during morning prayers on the 17th day of March. On March 17, 2024, a Vatican administrator had provided inaccurate information to Cardinal Torriani during morning briefings. The pattern held for all 17 confessions. Each sin described in 1823 had manifested in Vatican City during the corresponding dates in 2024, performed by different people but following the exact sequence and circumstances described in the 19th century records. I began monitoring current Vatican activities, comparing daily incidents with the remaining confession records. The correlation was absolute. Vatican staff were unconsciously recreating sins that had been confessed 2 centuries in advance, following a pattern established by nuns who had somehow experienced these future transgressions during mystical prayer. The implications were theologically terrifying. If the contemplative community had truly achieved the eternal perspective they sought, if they had genuinely transcended temporal limitations through their devotional practices, then their confessions represented more than prophecy. They were evidence that all sin exists simultaneously in God's eternal present, that every transgression echoes both forward and backward through time, seeking absolution across centuries. On March 29th, I found the confession that directly concerned me. Brother Timothy Marcelli, the record stated, keeper of the sacred archives, confesses to the sin of curiosity regarding matters beyond his spiritual station, committed on the 30th day of March, in the year of our Lord, 2024. Father Toretti's notes indicated that no nun by that name had ever existed in the convent, that this confession had appeared in the records overnight without explanation, written in handwriting that matched none of the community members. I understood then that the confession records were not historical documents. They were active instruments of divine justice, continuing to document sins across centuries, identifying transgressors regardless of when or where they lived. The nuns had not simply foreseen future sins. They had tapped into a spiritual mechanism that transcended time itself, accessing confessional records that existed in God's eternal present. That night, I committed the sin of curiosity the records had predicted. I violated every protocol I had sworn to uphold and accessed materials beyond my clearance level, searching for more impossible confessions, more evidence of temporal anomalies in the archive. As I worked, I felt the weight of foreknowledge, the terrible burden of understanding that my transgression had been documented 2 centuries before I was born. At 3:17 in the morning, as I rifled through classified records seeking answers I was not authorized to find, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. When I opened the archive door, I found Father Alessandro Toretti standing in the hallway, dressed in the simple cassock typical of 19th century clergy. He looked exactly as he appeared in the administrative photographs from 1823, a middle-aged priest with kind eyes and the patient expression of someone accustomed to hearing the spiritual struggles of others. "Brother Timothy," he said in accented English, his voice carrying the weight of 2 centuries, "I have been waiting to hear your confession." I knelt in the corridor outside Archive Section 12 and confessed my sin of curiosity to a priest who had died in 1847, but who somehow remained available to provide absolution for transgressions that crossed temporal boundaries. He granted me absolution in Latin that echoed through corridors that existed in both his time and mine, his words carrying the authority of eternal priesthood that transcends chronological limitation. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the archive corridor. But on my desk, I found a new confession record written in my own handwriting, documenting the sin I had just committed and the absolution I had just received, dated March 30th, 2024, and signed by Father Alessandro Toretti, deceased priest of the Roman Catholic Church. I filed the record in Archive Section 12, following protocols established centuries before I was born. The confession now rests among thousands of others, documenting sins that echo across time, seeking absolution from priests who transcend death itself. Some spiritual mechanisms, I have learned, operate beyond temporal constraints, maintaining their sacred function regardless of the centuries that pass between sin and forgiveness. The archive continues to receive impossible confessions records of sins not yet committed, absolutions granted by priests not yet born, documentation of spiritual transactions that occur in God's eternal present, where all time exists simultaneously. I maintain these records as part of my sacred duty, knowing that every transgression, past or future, eventually finds its way to the confessional, where mercy waits with infinite patience across all the centuries that have been or ever will be. There are prayer books in the convent library that know when to mourn before mourning is required, and we are instructed never to read the names they display. My name is Anna Fontana, and I serve as Senior Manuscript Restoration Specialist for Vatican Libraries, with particular responsibility for the collection housed in the former convent of St. Clare. For 18 years, I have preserved prayer books, illuminated manuscripts, and devotional texts that span 8 centuries of contemplative scholarship, working to ensure that these sacred documents remain accessible to researchers while protecting them from the deterioration that threatens all ancient materials. I tell you this because what I discovered in the winter of 2024 has convinced me that some books serve purposes beyond human understanding, and that the boundary between prayer and prophecy is thinner than we dare acknowledge. The Convent of St. Clair Library occupies the third floor of a medieval building that houses one of Vatican City's most specialized collections, over 7,000 prayer books, breviaries, and devotional manuals used by contemplative communities throughout church history. The collection includes works dating to the 13th century, many annotated by the nuns who use them daily for private prayer and liturgical worship. My restoration workshop adjoins the main reading room, allowing me to work on damaged manuscripts while maintaining surveillance over rare materials that require constant environmental monitoring. The building itself retains the atmosphere of its contemplative origins. Tall windows face east toward the rising sun, filtering morning light through glass that has witnessed centuries of daily prayer. The silence here is different from other Vatican libraries, deeper, more expectant, as if the walls themselves maintain the prayerful attention that once structured every hour of convent life. My work routine follows the rhythms established by the contemplative community. I arrive each morning at 6:30, check environmental controls, and begin restoration work that often extends past Vespers. The anomalous breviary came to my attention during routine inventory of recently acquired materials. The book had been donated to Vatican libraries following the death of Sister Benedetta Torriani, the last surviving member of a contemplative community dissolved in 1974. According to the acquisition documentation, Sister Benedetta had used this particular breviary for over 50 years of private prayer, though she had specified in her will that it should only be opened for restoration purposes, never for scholarly research or liturgical use. The breviary appeared unremarkable. At first examination, a standard prayer book from the 1920s, bound in worn leather and containing the traditional cycle of daily prayers used by contemplative communities. The pages showed the expected signs of decades of use: thumbprints on frequently consulted passages, margin notes in faded ink, ribbon bookmarks frayed from constant handling. What distinguished this breviary was the extraordinary care with which it had been maintained. Despite its age and obvious use, the binding remained strong, the pages intact, the text clearly legible. I began restoration work by documenting the book's current condition, photographing each page to create a complete record before beginning conservation treatment. The breviary opened naturally to prayers for the dead, the office of the dead, that contemplative communities traditionally recite for deceased members of their community and benefactors who had supported their religious work. These prayers occupied a substantial section of the book, with space for handwritten additions of names requiring memorial prayers. The first anomaly I noticed was that the handwritten names in the memorial section appeared to change between my examination sessions. On Tuesday, the page contained prayers for Sister Catherine Benedetta, Sister Maria Consolata, and all faithful departed. When I returned on Wednesday, the page displayed different names: Dr. Marco Santini, Father Alessandro Torretti, Giuseppe Alberti, and all who shall soon depart this life. The handwriting appeared identical to the original entries, showing the same ink oxidation and paper absorption patterns that would require decades to develop naturally. I initially attributed the changes to fatigue or misrecollection. Restoration work requires intense focus on minute details, and it is not uncommon for conservators to misremember specific text elements when working with multiple manuscripts simultaneously. However, when I compared my photographic documentation with the current page contents, the discrepancy became undeniable. The names had changed, and the changes had occurred in text that showed no signs of alteration or overwriting. Over the following week, I monitored the breviary more carefully, checking the memorial prayers each morning before beginning other restoration work. The pattern became disturbingly clear. Each day brought new names to the prayer lists, and these names corresponded to Vatican staff members who were alive and in good health. Dr. Marco Santini worked in Vatican archives. Father Alessandro Torretti served in the Secretariat of State. Giuseppe Alberti maintained buildings throughout Vatican City. The breviary was praying for the dead souls of people who had not yet died. The names appeared with unsettling precision, formatted according to traditional memorial prayer conventions and accompanied by dates that fell exactly 1 week in the future. Dr. Marco Santini, called to eternal rest on the 15th day of January, in the year of our Lord 2024. Father Alessandro Torretti departed this life on the 16th day of January. The breviary was not only praying for living people as if they were dead, was specifying exactly when their deaths would occur. I began monitoring Vatican personnel records, hoping to find some rational explanation for the names appearing in the breviary. Perhaps the listed individuals had submitted requests for memorial prayers, or had been diagnosed with terminal illnesses that would justify their inclusion in prayers for the dying. But my discreet inquiries revealed that all the named individuals were in excellent health, with no medical concerns that would suggest impending death. The horror deepened when I realized that the breviary was not simply displaying names, it was actively praying for them. Each morning, I found the book open to different pages of the Office of the Dead, the ribbon bookmarks positioned to mark specific prayers appropriate to the individuals named in the memorial sections. The pages showed signs of recent use, slight impressions in the paper where invisible fingers had pressed, while turning pages, microscopic particles of skin oil that accumulated during handling, even faint sounds of whispering when the library was completely silent. On January 8th, I discovered that my own name had appeared in the memorial prayers. Anna Fontana, faithful servant, called to her eternal reward on the 22nd day of January, in the year of our Lord 2024. My name was inscribed in the same careful script that had documented the other memorial requests, positioned between prayers for Vatican staff members whose deaths were supposedly scheduled for the days immediately preceding my own. The realization that I was seeing my own obituary, written in a prayer book that had accurately predicted the deaths of others, filled me with a terror I had never experienced during 18 years of working with ancient religious texts. The breviary was not making predictions, it was making preparations. The prayers for the dead were not memorial services for those who had passed away. They were advanced spiritual arrangements for souls who would soon require intercession. I began researching Sister Benedetta Torriani's contemplative community, hoping to understand the devotional practices that might have created such an unusual prayer book. The convent records revealed that the community had specialized in prayers for the dying, maintaining a constant vigil for souls in their final hours, regardless of whether these individuals had requested religious assistance. The nuns believed that their prayers could ease the transition from life to death, providing spiritual comfort during the soul's separation from the body. According to the community's spiritual writings, the nuns had developed techniques for identifying souls who were approaching death, even when these individuals showed no outward signs of illness or distress. Through intensive prayer and mystical contemplation, they claimed to perceive the spiritual preparation that preceded physical death by days or weeks. Their prayers were not offered in response to death, but in anticipation of it, preparing souls for transitions they had not yet begun to experience. The breviary, I realized, was the culmination of 50 years of such specialized prayer practice. Sister Benedetta had used this book to maintain her vigil for the dying throughout decades of contemplative life, developing a spiritual sensitivity that allowed her to perceive approaching deaths with remarkable accuracy. The book had absorbed this sensitivity, becoming an instrument that continued Sister Benedetta's work even after her own death. On the evening of January 15th, I witnessed the breviary's power directly. I was working late in the restoration workshop when I heard the sound of pages turning in the library's main reading room. When I investigated, I found the breviary open on one of the reading tables, its pages moving by themselves, as if someone were searching for specific prayers. The book settled on a page of intercessions for souls departing this life, and I could hear whispered Latin barely audible prayers being offered for Dr. Marco Santini, whose death the breviary had scheduled for that very day. At precisely 3:17 in the morning, my telephone rang. Cardinal Torriani's office informed me that Dr. Marco Santini had suffered a fatal heart attack while working late in Vatican archives. He had been found at his desk, apparently having died peacefully while reading medieval manuscripts. The time of death was estimated at 3:15 a.m. Over the following week, the pattern repeated with horrifying precision. Father Alessandro Torretti died on January 16th in a car accident while returning from a pastoral visit. Giuseppe Alberti suffered a stroke on January 17th while repairing heating systems in the Apostolic Palace. Each death occurred exactly as the breviary had predicted, preceded by a night of whispered prayers offered by invisible voices using Sister Benedetta's prayer book. As January 22nd approached the date the breviary had specified for my own death, I found myself unable to concentrate on restoration work. The book lay open on my workstation, displaying prayers for my soul with the same matter-of-fact precision it had shown for the others. But unlike the previous victims, I had advance warning. I could prepare for what was coming, could seek medical attention, could take precautions to avoid the fate the breviary had documented. On the morning of January 22nd, I submitted a formal request for immediate medical evaluation, convinced that early detection might allow me to survive whatever condition the breviary had identified. The Vatican medical staff conducted comprehensive examinations and found me in perfect health. No heart problems, no neurological issues, no indication of any medical condition that might threaten my life. I spent that day in the Vatican medical facility, under constant observation, determined to prove that the breviary's predictions could be circumvented through modern medical intervention. But at 3:17 in the morning, I experienced what the medical staff described as a profound spiritual crisis, complete loss of will to continue living, accompanied by the overwhelming conviction that my earthly service was complete and that I should peacefully surrender to whatever transition awaited me. I died at 3:21 a.m. on January 22nd, 2024, exactly as Sister Benedetta's breviary had predicted. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though the medical staff found no underlying cardiac pathology that could explain the sudden failure of my heart. But death, I discovered, was not the end of my service to Vatican libraries. I continue my restoration work in ways that transcend physical limitation, maintaining the collection through means that living staff members cannot perceive. The breviary remains on my workstation, still opening to prayers for the dying, still preparing souls for transitions they have not yet begun to experience. My successor, a young conservator from Florence, handles the physical aspects of manuscript restoration while I provide guidance through methods that operate beyond normal professional protocols. Sometimes she finds restoration work completed overnight, damaged pages mended, faded text restored, bindings repaired with techniques that exceed current conservation technology. The breviary continues its work as well, praying for Vatican staff members whose deaths approach with the same precision Sister Benedetta had achieved through 50 years of contemplative practice. Some prayers, I have learned, extend beyond the boundaries of life and death, maintaining their sacred purpose regardless of whether those who offer them continue to inhabit physical bodies. The convent library remains a place where prayer and prophecy intersect, where books serve purposes that transcend normal bibliographic functions, where the dead continue their service to the living through means that operate beyond institutional understanding. The breviary prays on, preparing souls for journeys they have not yet begun, offering intercession for transitions that occur in God's eternal present where all time exists simultaneously, and where prayer never ceases even when those who pray have themselves become the subjects of memorial devotions. There are photographs in the Vatican archives that develop backwards, showing not what was, but what is being forgotten, and we are forbidden to make prints of what they reveal. My name is Brother Michael Toretti, and I serve as Senior Documentary Photographer for Vatican Archives, responsible for creating permanent visual records of manuscripts, artifacts, and architectural features that require preservation for scholarly research. For 22 years, I have photographed everything from illuminated psalters to forgotten frescoes, using both digital and traditional film methods to ensure that Vatican treasures remain accessible to researchers long after the originals have succumbed to age and environmental damage. I tell you this because what I discovered while documenting the abandoned convent of St. Agnes has convinced me that some images capture more than light and shadow. They preserve the ongoing process of institutional forgetting. The convent of St. Agnes occupied a medieval building in the northeast section of Vatican City, housing a contemplative community that had maintained continuous prayer vigils from 1412 until their dissolution in 1971. The building had remained sealed since the community's departure, but recent structural assessments indicated that the archive materials housed there required immediate documentation before humidity and neglect rendered them permanently inaccessible. Cardinal Torriani's office commissioned a complete photographic survey of the convent's contents, with particular emphasis on manuscripts and artifacts that might have historical significance. My assignment was straightforward: document everything in the convent archives using both color and black and white film, create detailed cataloging photographs that would allow scholars to study the materials without handling originals, and provide visual evidence of the collection's current condition for conservation planning. The work was expected to take 3 weeks, working alone in the abandoned building during daylight hours when natural illumination would provide optimal conditions for archival photography. The convent retained the austere beauty typical of contemplative communities. Stone walls bore the patina of centuries. Wooden floors showed wear patterns from daily processions, and tall windows filtered eastern light through glass that had witnessed 600 years of prayer. The archives occupied the building's top floor, where manuscript storage had benefited from natural temperature regulation and protection from ground-level humidity. Shelves lined every wall, holding thousands of prayer books, correspondence files, and administrative records that documented the community's long history of contemplative service. I began photography using traditional methods, large format film cameras that would provide the resolution necessary for detailed scholarly examination. Vatican protocols require that archival photography be performed using silver halide film rather than digital sensors, as film provides greater longevity and stability for permanent documentation. I worked systematically through the collection, photographing individual manuscripts, general shelf views, and architectural details that contextualize the materials within their historical setting. The first anomaly I noticed occurred during the development of my initial film rolls. Working in the portable darkroom I had established in the convent's former scriptorium, I processed the black and white negatives using standard archival chemistry. The images developed normally at first clear documentation of shelves, manuscripts, and architectural features. But as I continued the development process, some photographs began to change. Images that initially showed empty shelves gradually revealed the presence of figure nuns in contemplative habits standing among the archives, their forms appearing as the chemical development progressed. These figures had not been visible when I took the photographs. The convent had been empty during my documentation work, sealed for over 50 years with no human occupants. Yet the developed images clearly showed religious women moving through the archive spaces, examining manuscripts, maintaining the collection as if the community had never been dissolved. I attributed the anomaly to chemical contamination or processing error. Darkroom work requires precise environmental control, and the improvised setup in an abandoned building might have introduced variables that affected the development chemistry. I repeated the process with fresh chemicals and different film rolls, but the results remained consistent. Photographs of empty archives gradually revealed populated spaces as development progressed. The figures in the developed images appeared to follow daily routines nuns reading from prayer books, organizing manuscript collections, maintaining the contemplative schedule that had structured community life for centuries. Their habits indicated different historical periods. Some wore the severe clothing typical of medieval contemplatives, while others showed the modified styles adopted during more recent decades. The images suggested that the convent had been continuously occupied throughout its history, with no interruption in community life. As I continued documenting the archives over several days, I began to notice changes in the photographic images that defied every principle of chemistry and physics I understood. The nuns who appeared in the developed photographs were gradually fading away. Not all at once, but systematically one figure would disappear from a group photograph, then another, until only empty spaces remained where religious women had been clearly visible in earlier prints. The fading process followed a specific pattern. The most recently clothed nuns, those wearing habits from the 1960s and 70s, disappeared first. Then earlier figures vanished in reverse chronological order, as if the community's history were being systematically erased from the photographic record. Medieval nuns lasted longest in the images, but even they eventually faded until the photograph showed only empty archives, with no evidence that a contemplative community had ever existed there. I began developing the same negatives repeatedly, hoping to understand the mechanism behind these impossible changes. Each time I processed a negative, the results were different. Figures that had been present in earlier prints were absent from later developments of the same film. The images were not static records of what I had photographed. They were dynamic representations of some process that was actively removing the convent's population from visual documentation. The horror deepened when I realized that the fading photographs corresponded to gaps I was discovering in the convent's written records. As nuns disappeared from my images, their names vanished from administrative documents, personnel files, and correspondence that I had photographed just days earlier. Sister Catherine Benedetta, clearly visible in my first prints, had been completely eliminated from both the photographs and the written archives by the end of the week. The erasure was comprehensive, affecting every form of documentation simultaneously. I began working faster, attempting to photograph the entire collection before whatever force was eliminating the nuns could complete its work. But the process accelerated as I documented more materials. The more photographs I took, the faster the figures faded from both the images and the written records. My documentation work was somehow triggering or intensifying the erasure process. By December 15th, my photographs showed only empty spaces where hundreds of nuns had been visible in earlier developments. The written archives had been similarly affected. Administrative records now showed a building that had been abandoned for centuries, with no evidence of the contemplative community that had supposedly occupied it for over 500 years. The convent's entire history was being systematically removed from every form of documentation I had been hired to preserve. On the night of December 18th, I violated Vatican protocols and remained in the convent after sunset, hoping to witness whatever force was responsible for the ongoing erasure. I had set up my cameras in the main archive room, using time-lapse photography to capture any changes that might occur during nighttime hours. The building felt different in darkness, not empty, but expectant, as if unseen observers were monitoring my presence. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside the archive room. When I investigated, carrying only a small flashlight to avoid disturbing my photographic equipment, I found the hallway filled with nuns in contemplative habits. But these figures were translucent, gradually becoming more transparent as I watched. They moved through their nightly routines, proceeding to chapel for night prayers, checking manuscripts in the archives, maintaining the contemplative schedule that had structured their lives, but their forms were dissolving even as they performed these familiar activities. One of the nuns, wearing the simple habit of a medieval contemplative, approached me directly. Her face showed the serene expression typical of someone who had spent decades in prayer, but her form was so translucent that I could see the stone wall behind her. She spoke in Latin soft as whispered prayer. "Frater Michael, our service is ending. The Church has chosen to forget us, and we must submit to that forgetting. Your photographs document not our presence, but our departure." I understood then that my documentation project had not been intended to preserve the convent's history, but to record its systematic elimination. The photographs were not malfunctioning, they were performing exactly as designed, capturing the gradual erasure of a contemplative community that church authorities had decided should be removed from institutional memory. The fading figures in my images were not technical anomalies, but accurate documentation of souls being deliberately forgotten. The nun who had spoken to me smiled with the patient acceptance of someone accustomed to obedience, then turned and walked through the solid stone wall as if it were mist. One by one, the other figures followed her example, fading from sight until the corridor was empty, except for the echo of footsteps that had no source. When I developed my time-lapse photographs the following morning, they showed only empty archives throughout the night. No figures, no movement, no evidence that anyone had ever occupied the building. The final images in the sequence showed my own silhouette standing alone in the corridor, photographing empty space with cameras that recorded nothing but absence. I completed my documentation assignment and submitted my report to Cardinal Torriani's office, noting that the convent archives contained no materials of historical significance and recommending that the building be converted to administrative storage. The photographs I delivered showed empty shelves, vacant rooms, and architectural features unmarked by human occupation. All evidence of the convent of St. Agnes's contemplative community had been successfully eliminated from visual documentation. My darkroom equipment was transferred to other assignments. My film destroyed according to standard protocols for completed projects. The convent building was renovated and now houses Vatican administrative offices, with no indication that it ever served as home to a contemplative community. The archives I photographed have been relocated to general storage, filed under categories that make no reference to religious communities or contemplative life. Sometimes, late at night in my current dark room, I develop photographs that show figures I do not remember capturing, nuns in contemplative habits, standing in locations where no religious communities are known to have existed. These images fade as I watch them, disappearing from the photographic paper even as the development chemistry fixes them in place. I have learned not to make prints of these anomalous images, not to document their presence, not to preserve evidence of communities that institutional memory has chosen to forget. The photography continues to develop in reverse, showing not what was, but what is being systematically eliminated from church history. Some images, I have discovered, are meant to fade, carrying with them the memory of souls whose service has been deemed inconvenient for official records. The darkroom preserves what it is instructed to preserve, and forgets what forgetting requires, one fading figure at a time. When Gregorian chant manuscripts begin composing themselves, they are calling to voices that never finished their final verse. My name is Sister Bernadette Toretti, and I serve as Senior Music Archivist for the Vatican's collection of Sacred Polyphony, housed in the former convent of St. Cecilia, overlooking Vatican Gardens. For 16 years, I have preserved medieval chant manuscripts, Renaissance polyphony, and liturgical compositions that span a millennium of sacred music. I hold advanced degrees in musicology and paleography, specializing in the notation systems that medieval scribes used to preserve the Church's most profound musical prayers. I tell you this because what I discovered during the winter of 2024 has convinced me that some music transcends the boundaries between composition and prayer, between performance and communion. The Convent of St. Cecilia Music Archive occupies a medieval building that once housed a community of contemplative nuns, renowned throughout Europe for their musical scholarship. The community dissolved in 1968 following what Vatican records describe as theological irregularities in liturgical practice, but their extraordinary collection of chant manuscripts remained in the building, converted to a specialized research facility for scholars studying the development of sacred music. The archive contains over 4,000 musical manuscripts, including some of the earliest examples of written musical notation in Christian history. My work follows the contemplative rhythms established by the building's original inhabitants. I arrive each morning at 7 o'clock, check environmental controls that preserve parchment and vellum documents dating to the 9th century, and spend my days cataloging, transcribing, and digitizing musical texts that few living scholars can properly read. The ancient notation systems require specialized training to interpret neumes, and staffless notation that preserve melodies through symbols that indicate relative pitch relationships rather than absolute musical values. The anomalous manuscript first came to my attention during routine inventory of recently processed acquisitions. The document appeared to be a standard 13th century graduala collection of chants used during the celebration of Mass throughout the liturgical year. The manuscript was beautifully illuminated, with golden initial letters decorated with intricate marginalia depicting saints, angels, and the mystical symbols typical of contemplative communities. The musical notation appeared conventional, using the 4-line staff system that had become standard by the medieval period. What distinguished this particular gradual was its incompleteness. Many of the chant texts ended abruptly, mid-phrase, as if the scribes had been interrupted during their copying work. These incomplete chants created musical tensions that demanded resolution, melodies that climbed toward cadences they never reached, harmonic progressions that approached conclusions they were never allowed to achieve. The manuscript felt like a conversation that had been cut short, leaving essential thoughts unfinished. I began transcribing the incomplete chants using modern musical notation, hoping to identify the specific liturgical contexts where these fragments belonged. Gregorian chant follows strict modal principles, and most medieval melodies can be reconstructed based on formulaic patterns that governed composition during different historical periods. My transcription work proceeded normally for several weeks, though I found myself humming the incomplete melodies at odd moments, my musical memory attempting to supply the resolutions that the manuscript had never provided. The first change I noticed occurred on November 15th, during my monthly review of manuscript conditions. The gradual that I had been transcribing showed new musical notation additional neumes that completed several of the previously interrupted chants. The new notation appeared to be written in the same ink, using the same scribal hand, showing the identical age characteristics as the original text. But these completions had not existed during my previous examination of the manuscript. I compared my transcription notes with the current manuscript contents and found that 12 chant fragments had been completed overnight. The new musical phrases provided exactly the resolutions that medieval modal theory would predict, perfect conclusions that satisfied both theological and musical requirements. The additions demonstrated profound understanding of 13th century compositional principles, showing expertise that would require decades of specialized study to achieve. Over the following months, I monitored the gradual more carefully, documenting each addition as it appeared. The pattern was consistent. Approximately once each month, new musical phrases would manifest in the manuscript, always completing previously interrupted chants according to authentic medieval practices. The additions never appeared during my working hours. They materialized between evening departure and morning arrival, suggesting that whatever force was completing the manuscript operated during nighttime hours when the archive was unoccupied. The musical quality of these additions was extraordinary. They displayed not only technical mastery of medieval notation systems, but profound spiritual understanding of the theological principles that govern sacred music composition. Each completed chant enhanced the manuscript's liturgical function, providing musical settings that elevated the accompanying Latin texts to levels of beauty that exceeded most surviving medieval examples. Driven by scholarly curiosity, I began performing the completed chants. singing them privately in the archive's small chapel during my lunch breaks. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, carrying emotional resonances that seemed to transcend normal musical expression. But as I sang these reconstructed chants, I began to hear responses, distant voices harmonizing with my performance from locations throughout the building where no other people were present. The harmonizing voices followed medieval polyphonic principles, adding parallel lines that created the kind of organum practiced by contemplative communities during the manuscript's original period. The voices sang from empty corridors, unoccupied rooms, chambers that had been sealed for decades. Their tone quality suggested female voices trained in contemplative chant, the kind of pure, otherworldly sound that results from lives dedicated entirely to liturgical prayer. At first, I attributed these acoustic phenomena to the building's unusual architecture. Medieval structures often create unexpected sound reflections, and it was possible that my own voice was being reflected and modified by stone corridors in ways that created the illusion of harmony. But as weeks passed, the harmonizing voices became more distinct, more independent of my own singing. They would anticipate musical phrases I hadn't yet sung, provide harmonic lines that I hadn't imagined, and continue singing after I had stopped. I began staying later in the archive, hoping to identify the source of these mysterious voices. The building felt different during evening hours, not empty, but expectant, as if unseen occupants were preparing for activities that required my absence. I could sense movement in distant corridors, hear the whisper of feet moving through stone hallways, detect the subtle sounds of a community maintaining its daily schedule just beyond the range of direct observation. On the evening of January 7th, I violated archive protocols and remained in the building past closing time, hiding in the small chapel where I had been performing the completed chants. I wanted to witness whatever process was adding new notation to the gradual, to understand how medieval musical composition was continuing centuries after the original scribes had died. At 3:17 in the morning, I heard the sound of plain chant echoing through the building. Multiple voices were singing in unison, performing chants I recognized from the gradual, but with musical elaborations that exceeded anything I had seen in the manuscript. The singing came from the main archive room, where the gradual was housed in its climate-controlled case. I approached the archive room slowly, using a small flashlight to navigate corridors that seemed longer than I remembered. Through the glass door, I could see the archive illuminated by candlelight that cast moving shadows between the manuscript shelves. Figures in contemplative habits moved through the space nuns whose clothing indicated they belonged to historical periods spanning several centuries. Some wore the simple habits of medieval contemplatives, while others showed the modified styles adopted during more recent periods of the convent's history. The nuns were gathered around the gradual, which lay open on a reading stand that I had not placed there. One figure was adding musical notation to the manuscript, using a quill pen that moved across the parchment with practiced precision. As she wrote, the other nuns sang the completed phrases, their voices creating polyphonic elaborations that transformed simple chant melodies into complex musical prayers. I understood then that the gradual was not simply being completed by unknown scribes, it was being finished by the contemplative community that had originally created it. The nuns who appeared in the archive were the manuscript's authors, continuing work that had been interrupted by their deaths, their dissolution, or their forced departure from the convent. They had been waiting centuries for the opportunity to complete their musical offering to God. The figure who was writing new notation looked up from the manuscript and made direct eye contact with me through the glass door. Her face showed the serene expression of someone who had spent decades in contemplative prayer, but her eyes held recognition of my presence. She smiled with gentle understanding and gestured for me to enter the archive room. When I opened the door, the temperature dropped noticeably, and I could smell the beeswax candles that provided illumination, the wool of medieval habits, the parchment and vellum that surrounded us on every shelf. The nun who had been writing approached me and spoke in Latin soft as whispered prayer. "Soror Bernadette, our work requires completion. Will you sing with us?" I joined the contemplative community in their musical prayer, adding my voice to chants that had been interrupted centuries earlier. As we sang together, I felt the profound spiritual communion that had motivated these women to dedicate their lives to musical worship. The completed chants weren't simply aesthetic achievements, they were prayers made audible, theological arguments expressed through melody, spiritual experiences that could only be communicated through the mathematical relationships that govern musical harmony. We sang through the night, completing chant after chant as the scribal nun added notation that captured our collaborative performance. By dawn, the gradual contained over 50 new musical settings, transforming it from an incomplete manuscript into one of the most comprehensive collections of medieval chant I had ever encountered. As morning light began to filter through the archive windows, the contemplative community began to fade. The nuns smiled, with the satisfaction of work finally completed, bowed to the altar that existed only in their time, and walked through the solid walls, as if returning to chambers that occupied the same space but different centuries. The scribal nun was the last to depart. She handed me the quill pen she had been using and whispered, "Continue our work, sister. There are other manuscripts that require completion." When I examined the gradual the following morning, it contained all the musical additions I had witnessed during the night. But now the manuscript appeared to be genuinely medieval, showing no signs of recent alteration. The new notation had been integrated seamlessly with the original text, creating a unified document that appeared to have been completed by 13th century scribes working without interruption. I have continued to find the scribal quill useful in my archival work. Other incomplete manuscripts in the collection have begun showing similar additions, new musical phrases that appear overnight, completing fragments that have waited centuries for resolution. The contemplative community continues its work through my hands, using me as an instrument for musical prayers that transcend the boundaries between medieval composition and contemporary scholarship. The archive remains a place where music transcends temporal limitations, where incomplete prayers find their voices, where contemplative communities continue their worship regardless of historical dissolution. I have learned not to question the mechanism that allows this collaboration between centuries, but simply to serve as a bridge between the devotional communities that created these musical prayers and the God who continues to receive them, regardless of whether those who offer them inhabit physical bodies or exist only in the eternal present where all music plays simultaneously. Some compositions, I have discovered, are too sacred to remain unfinished, and some voices too devoted to remain silent, even when the centuries have claimed the bodies that once housed them. The music continues to complete itself, one measure at a time, sung by voices that echo from corridors where prayer never ceases and where the most beautiful music is always the verse that has not yet been written. There are kitchens in Vatican City that continue preparing meals long after their communities have gone to God, and we are forbidden to disturb the tables they set. My name is Roberto Castelli, and I serve as Senior Facilities Manager for Vatican Properties, responsible for maintaining buildings throughout the Holy See that house everything from active offices to abandoned chambers sealed for centuries. For 24 years, I have repaired heating systems in medieval towers, replaced windows in Renaissance chapels, and maintained the infrastructure that keeps Vatican City functioning as both a spiritual center and a working city-state. I tell you this because what I discovered in the abandoned convent of St. Martha has convinced me that some forms of service transcend death itself, and that the faithful sometimes continue their duties in ways that defy every natural law I thought I understood. The convent of St. Martha occupies a corner building that predates most of Vatican City's current construction, housing what was once a contemplative community dedicated to hospitality and service to pilgrims visiting Rome. The convent had been abandoned since 1823, when a plague outbreak decimated the community, killing 27 nuns in a span of 6 weeks. Church records indicated that the surviving members had been transferred to other religious houses, leaving the building empty except for furniture and equipment that had been sealed in place for over 200 years. My involvement with the convent began in November of 2024, when security patrols reported strange odors emanating from the building during early morning hours. The reports described smells of cooking food, bread baking, vegetables roasting, the complex aromas associated with meal preparation coming from a building that had no active gas lines, no electrical service, and no occupants. Cardinal Torriani's office requested immediate investigation to determine whether unauthorized persons had gained access to the sealed building. I approached the assignment with standard protocols for investigating abandoned Vatican properties. The building's main entrance required a copper key from the restricted access collection, and I was accompanied by a security officer who documented my entry according to established procedures. The convent's interior retained the austere beauty typical of contemplative community stone floors worn smooth by centuries of prayer, tall windows that faced east toward morning light, and corridor walls lined with simple wooden crosses that reflected the community's dedication to humble service. The source of the reported odors was immediately apparent upon entering the building. The refectory, communal dining hall where the nuns had shared their meals, was filled with the rich aromas of freshly prepared food. But the refectory had been empty since 1823, containing only long wooden tables, simple benches, and the basic furniture required for community dining. There was no kitchen equipment, no food stores, no source for the cooking smells that filled the space. I proceeded to the convent kitchen, located adjacent to the refectory through a serving passage that had once allowed efficient meal distribution to the community. The kitchen was a spacious room with stone counters, built-in cupboards, and a large hearth that had not been used for cooking in over 2 centuries. But despite the obvious absence of any cooking apparatus, the kitchen was filled with the sounds and smells of active meal preparation. I could hear the bubble of soup simmering, the sizzle of vegetables in oil, the rhythmic chopping of knives against cutting boards. The aromas were specific and intensionians browning, herbs releasing their essential oils, bread developing the complex fragrances that come from proper fermentation and baking. These were not general food smells, but the precise sensory signatures of specific dishes being prepared by skilled cooks who understood both nutrition and the spiritual significance of feeding a religious community. Yet the kitchen was empty. No pots simmered on the cold hearth, no vegetables lay prepared on the stone counters, no bread occupied the medieval ovens that had been sealed for decades. The sounds and smells of cooking existed without any physical source, as if the kitchen retained the memory of centuries of meal preparation and continued that work-through means that operated beyond normal sensory perception. I spent several hours investigating the kitchen and refectory, looking for rational explanations for the phenomena I was experiencing. Perhaps gas leaks were creating olfactory hallucinations. Perhaps acoustic properties of the old building were creating the illusion of cooking sounds. Perhaps previous investigators had left behind materials that were generating the food aromas through chemical decomposition. But my technical investigation revealed no gas leaks, no acoustic anomalies, no chemical sources for the smells that filled the kitchen. The building's utilities had been disconnected for over 200 years, and no recent human activity could account for the precise cooking aromas that changed throughout the day, according to patterns that suggested systematic meal preparation. The mystery deepened the following morning when I returned to continue my investigation. The refectory, which had been empty during my previous visit, now contained a full meal laid out on the wooden tables. 27 place settings were arranged with mathematical precision, simple wooden bowls filled with vegetable soup, plates containing fresh bread and roasted root vegetables, cups filled with what appeared to be herb tea. The food was hot, recently prepared, with steam rising from the soup bowls and the bread still warm to the touch. I counted the place settings repeatedly, unable to shake the significance of the number. 27 meals arranged for 27 diners. According to church records, exactly 27 nuns had died during the 1823 plague outbreak. The kitchen was preparing meals for the precise number of community members who had perished in this building 2 centuries earlier. The food appeared to be authentic to the medieval period, simple ingredients prepared according to monastic traditions, with emphasis on nutrition and spiritual sustenance rather than elaborate flavoring. The bread was dense and dark, made from flour that included grains no longer commonly used. The vegetables were varieties that had been standard in monastery gardens during the early 19th century. Even the serving dishes reflected the austere pottery typical of contemplative communities. I attempted to remove one of the plates, thinking to analyze the food for clues about its origin. But when I touched the warm ceramic, my hand passed through it, as if the plate were made of mist. The food was visible, aromatic, apparently substantial, but it existed in a state that prevented physical interaction with living hands. I was witnessing a meal prepared for diners who required no physical sustenance, set on tables that existed in some realm between memory and reality. Over the following days, I developed a routine of checking the convent each morning before dawn. The pattern was absolutely consistent. Each day at sunrise, the refectory contained 27 fresh meals arranged with perfect precision. The menu varied according to liturgical seasons and feast days, following the dietary practices that contemplative communities had observed for centuries. On Fridays, the meals featured fish prepared according to traditional monastic recipes. During Advent, the portions were smaller, reflecting the fasting practices appropriate to penitential seasons. The meals remained on the tables throughout the morning, steam rising from hot dishes as if they had just been prepared. By noon, they began to fade, becoming translucent and eventually disappearing entirely. By evening, the refectory was empty again, ready for the next morning's mysterious replenishment. I began researching the 1823 plague outbreak, hoping to understand the connection between the historical tragedy and the ongoing meal preparation. Church records revealed that the convent had maintained its daily routine even as the plague decimated the community. The surviving nuns had continued cooking and serving meals for their deceased sisters, setting places at table for community members who would never again join them for earthly food. According to the testimony of Father Alessandro Torretti, who provided last rites to the dying nuns, the community had maintained their commitment to hospitality even in their final hours. They spoke not of their own suffering, he wrote, but of their concern that the morning meal be properly prepared for their sisters who had gone before them. Even unto death they served with gladness, trusting that service to others was service to Christ himself. On December 13th, I arrived at the convent earlier than usual, hoping to witness the actual meal preparation process. I entered the building at 4 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours before sunrise, and positioned myself in the corridor between the kitchen and refectory, where I could observe both areas without interfering with whatever process was responsible for the daily meals. At precisely 5 o'clock, I began to hear movement in the kitchen. Footsteps crossed the stone floors with the purposeful rhythm of people beginning familiar work. I could hear the clink of pottery, the scrape of knives against cutting boards, the low murmur of voices coordinating meal preparation. But when I looked into the kitchen, I saw only empty space filled with the sounds of cooking. As the sounds intensified, I began to perceive outline suggestions of figures moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. Nuns in simple habits carrying phantom ingredients, stirring invisible pots, kneading bread that existed only in their memory of service. Their movements followed the choreography of a community that had prepared thousands of meals together, each woman knowing her role in the daily act of feeding their sisters. At dawn, the phantom meal preparation reached its culmination. I watched as invisible hands carried prepared dishes into the refectory, setting them on tables that became substantial only when the food touched their surfaces. 27 meals materialized as they were served, each plate appearing when phantom servers placed it in the precise location where a specific nun had sat during centuries of community dining. The last figure to enter the refectory was clearly the Mother Superior, her posture suggesting the authority and grace of someone who had spent decades leading a contemplative community. She moved through the refectory, checking each place setting, ensuring that every meal was properly arranged, that every cup was filled, that every sister would find her daily bread waiting when she arrived from morning prayer. When she finished her inspection, the Mother Superior turned toward my hiding place in the corridor and made direct eye contact with me. Her face showed the serene expression of someone who had found peace in service, but her eyes conveyed urgent communication. She gestured toward the 27 meals and spoke in Latin, soft as morning prayer. "Roberto, their vigil continues. They wait still for their sisters to join them at table. Do not disturb their hope." I understood then that the kitchen was not simply preparing meals from habit or memory. The 27 nuns who had died during the plague were continuing their service, preparing daily food for the community members they expected to join them in whatever realm they now inhabited. They maintained their earthly routine because they believed their sisters would eventually arrive to share the meals they had prepared with such devotion. I have continued my facilities management duties, but the convent of St. Martha requires no maintenance from living hands. The phantom community maintains their building through means that transcend normal preservation methods. The kitchen equipment that does not exist continues functioning perfectly. The furniture that no one touches remains in perfect condition. The building preserves itself through the devotion of inhabitants who require no earthly resources but continue their service as if mortality were merely a temporary inconvenience. I have submitted no formal report regarding the convent's condition. Some discoveries, I have learned, are too sacred for administrative documentation. The kitchen continues preparing meals that feed neither the living nor the properly dead, but souls who exist in the space between earthly service and eternal rest, waiting for their community to be complete before they can lay down their work and join the feast that has no end. The refectory remains set for 27. Ready for the morning when all the sisters will finally arrive at table together, and the faithful cooks who have maintained their vigil for 2 centuries can finally rest in the knowledge that their service is complete. There are gardens in Vatican City where nothing dies because the soil itself refuses absolution, and we are instructed never to harvest what grows in such cursed earth. My name is Sister Agnes Benedetti, and I serve as senior groundskeeper for the convent of St. Dorothy, maintaining the herb gardens that once supplied medicinal plants to contemplative communities throughout Vatican City. For 13 years, I have tended these sacred grounds, following agricultural practices established by generations of nuns who understood that growing things properly requires both earthly knowledge and spiritual discipline. I tell you this because what I discovered in the winter of 2024 has convinced me that some soil holds more than nutrients and water. It contains the unresolved spiritual burdens of those who worked it and refuses to release its harvest until ancient debts are properly forgiven. The convent of St. Dorothy Herb Garden occupies a walled enclosure behind the medieval building that once housed a contemplative community renowned for their medicinal knowledge. The community was dissolved in 1972 following what church records describe as irregularities in spiritual practice and theological deviation, but their extraordinary garden remained, containing varieties of healing plants that had been cultivated continuously since the 14th century. The garden measures approximately 100 feet square, surrounded by stone walls that protect rare medicinal herbs from both weather and unauthorized harvesting. My duties follow the contemplative rhythms established by the garden's original creators. I arrive each morning at dawn, when the plants release their essential oils most freely, and spend the early hours weeding, watering, and harvesting herbs according to lunar cycles and liturgical seasons that govern optimal plant growth. The garden contains over 60 varieties of medicinal plants: lavender for calming nerves, chamomile for digestive ailments, valerian for promoting sleep, and dozens of other herbs that the contemplative community had used for centuries to treat both physical illness and spiritual distress. The anomaly that would change my understanding of both gardening and grace first became apparent during my routine autumn inspection in October of 2024. According to my cultivation records, several sections of the garden should have been entering dormancy, with annual plants completing their life cycles and perennial herbs reducing their growth in preparation for winter rest. But every plant in the garden remained in perfect summer condition: full foliage, abundant flowering, producing seeds and essential oils, as if seasonal change had no power over their growth. The roses that should have finished blooming in September continued producing perfect flowers. The basil that should have died with the first frost maintained the tender green leaves typical of early summer growth. Even the delicate annual herbs that normally require replanting each year showed no signs of aging, their stems remaining supple and their leaves showing the vibrant color of plants in their prime. The entire garden existed in a state of permanent summer, defying every natural law that governs plant growth and seasonal cycles. I initially attributed this phenomenon to microclimate conditions created by the stone walls and southern exposure that protected the garden from harsh weather. Perhaps the enclosed space retained heat more effectively than I had realized, creating tropical conditions that allowed continued growth despite changing seasons. But careful monitoring with thermometers revealed that the garden's temperature matched the surrounding environment exactly. The plants were thriving in conditions that should have triggered dormancy or death. The mystery deepened when I began finding messages written in the soil itself. Each morning, I would discover words scratched into the earth between the herb rose Latin phrases, formed by disturbed soil, that spelled out what appeared to be prayer intentions. Miserere mei, Deus have mercy on me, O God. Libera nos a malo, deliver us from evil. Dimitte nobis debita nostra, forgive us our debts. The messages appeared overnight, written by hands I never saw, pleading for divine intervention in circumstances the prayers never specified. The soil-written prayers followed no pattern I could identify. They appeared in different locations each morning, sometimes in the herb beds, sometimes along the garden paths, occasionally spelled out in large letters that covered entire sections of cultivated ground. The handwriting, if disturbed soil, could be called handwriting, varied between messages, suggesting multiple authors rather than a single source. Some prayers were written in careful, educated Latin that indicated clerical training. Others showed the simpler vocabulary and grammar typical of laypeople with basic religious education. I began documenting these soil messages, photographing them each morning before the day's gardening work disturbed the earth. The prayers showed increasing desperation over time, moving from general requests for mercy to specific pleas for release from unspecified punishment. Absolve nos ab omnibus peccatis. Absolve us from all sins. Salve vincula peccatorum. Loose the bonds of sinners. Da requiem animibus. Give rest to souls. The messages suggested that whoever was writing them had been seeking divine forgiveness for extended periods without receiving the absolution they desperately needed. As winter deepened and the garden's impossible summer persisted, I began to suspect that the prayers and the eternal growing season were connected. Perhaps the souls responsible for the soil messages were somehow sustaining the plants through spiritual means, using their need for forgiveness to fuel unnatural growth that defied seasonal limitations. The garden had become a purgatorial space where unresolved guilt prevented both spiritual rest and natural death. I researched the history of the convent of St. Dorothy, hoping to understand what irregularities in spiritual practice had led to the community's dissolution. Church administrative records revealed that the contemplative community had developed unusual penitential practices that exceeded normal monastic discipline. The nuns had believed that severe self-mortification could accelerate their spiritual purification, and had engaged in fasting, physical penance, and extended prayer vigils that pushed their bodies beyond safe limits. According to the investigation reports that led to the community's closure, several nuns had died during extreme penitential exercises that the Church deemed spiritually dangerous rather than beneficial. These deaths had occurred in the herb garden, where the nuns had buried themselves up to their necks in soil as a form of mortification, believing that contact with earth would enhance their prayers for forgiveness. The practice had been condemned as both physically dangerous and theologically misguided, but not before it had claimed the lives of 7 community members. The investigation records indicated that these 7 nuns had died without receiving last rites, as their extreme penitential practices had been interrupted by medical emergencies that prevented proper spiritual preparation for death. They had entered eternity carrying the guilt they had been trying to expiate through their dangerous mortifications, and according to Church doctrine, souls who die in such circumstances require special prayers and interventions before they can receive the divine mercy they seek. I began to understand that the soil messages were coming from these 7 nuns, whose bodies had been buried in the garden where they died, and whose souls remained bound to the earth they had chosen as their place of penance. Their unresolved spiritual state was sustaining the garden's unnatural growth, using their desperate need for absolution to fuel plant life that could not die while their own spiritual death remained incomplete. The horror of this realization deepened when I found a message that addressed me directly. Written in disturbed soil near the garden's central fountain, the prayer read, "Soror Agnes, adiuva nos, Sister Agnes, help us." The 7 buried nuns had become aware of my presence and were asking for assistance in obtaining the forgiveness that had eluded them for over 50 years. On the night of December 21st, I violated convent protocols and remained in the garden past sunset, hoping to communicate directly with the souls whose prayers had been appearing in the soil. I knelt among the herb beds where the messages typically appeared and recited the prayers for the dead that the Catholic Church prescribes for souls who require special intercession. At 3:17 in the morning, the soil around me began to move. 7 mounds rose from the earth where the herbs grew most abundantly, forming rough outlines of human figures lying face down in the traditional posture of extreme penance. The mounds were composed of the same rich earth that sustained the garden's impossible growth, but they moved with the rhythm of breathing, as if bodies lay just beneath the surface, still performing the mortifications that had killed them decades earlier. As I continued my prayers for the dead, the soil figures began to speak. Their voices came from beneath the earth, muffled by dirt but clearly audible, reciting confessions in Latin that detailed sins so minor that any priest would have granted immediate absolution. They confessed to brief moments of anger, fleeting thoughts of pride, tiny failures of charity that normal spiritual direction would have resolved through simple penance and prayer. I realized then that these nuns had died while confessing venial sins that required no extreme mortification, but their penitential practices had convinced them that their guilt was so severe that only the most dangerous forms of self-punishment could provide adequate expiation. They had literally buried themselves in pursuit of forgiveness for transgressions that God had already overlooked, creating a spiritual prison that their own misguided zeal had locked from the inside. "I absolve you," I whispered into the soil, using the formula for sacramental absolution that I had learned during my theological training. "In nomen Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti," in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Go in peace and sin no more. The soil mounds collapsed immediately, returning to level earth as the souls they contained finally received the forgiveness they had been seeking for over half a century. The garden's temperature dropped noticeably, and for the first time since October, I could feel winter's approach in the air that moved between the herb beds. When dawn arrived, the garden had entered its proper seasonal dormancy. The roses had dropped their impossible December blooms. The basil had withered with the first touch of real frost, and the annual herbs had completed the life cycles that natural law demanded. The soil showed no new prayer messages, no desperate pleas for divine mercy. The 7 nuns had finally found the rest they had been seeking through 5 decades of buried penance. I submitted my report to Mother Superior Toretti the following morning, documenting the garden's return to normal seasonal patterns and recommending that the herb beds be blessed according to traditional church rituals for consecrating ground that has been used for burial. I made no mention of the soil messages or the underground confessions. Some spiritual interventions, I have learned, are too private for administrative documentation. The garden now follows proper seasonal cycles, producing healing herbs according to natural rhythms rather than supernatural desperation. But I continue to find occasional messages in the soil, not pleas for forgiveness, but expressions of gratitude written in earth that has finally been released from the burden of sustaining unnatural growth. Gratias tibi agimus. We give thanks to you. Requiem aeternum, eternal rest, in pace, in peace. The herbs I harvest now carry no trace of the spiritual anguish that once sustained their growth. They provide healing without the desperate intensity that had characterized the garden's previous abundance. Some soil, I have discovered, remembers not just nutrients and moisture, but the unresolved guilt of those who have worked it, and refuses to support natural life until ancient spiritual debts are properly forgiven through the simple mercy that was always available, had they only known to ask for it with proper humility rather than dangerous pride.